and administration. Recruitment strategies and plans are important to ensure that people with the right knowledge and skills as required by the system are employed, and an effective human resource management system will ensure that those people continue to deliver as expected in their service. Give effect to the commitments contained in this charter, all states need to ensure that the charter is implemented. At state level, states need to enact laws that align with the charter and integrate its policies into national policy. The charter will also need to be disseminated widely to ensure that all members of the public service understand what is required. With a view to ensuring and facilitating the implementation of this charter at continental level, it is important that implementation guidelines are developed and ratified. Harmonize policies in line with the charter among member states and establish a secretariat to coordinate and undertake the implementation of duties, obligations, and responsibilities enshrined in this charter. Member states can then periodically meet to discuss the charter and updates policies as and when required. Within regions and in line with the various laws in each country, the regional economic communities should encourage their member states to ratify or accede to this charter, implement it, and integrate and take into account the objectives, principles, and values of this charter in the drafting and adoption of their legal instruments. Reporting and follow-up mechanisms. States shall submit every 2 years from the date the charter comes into force, a report to the Commission on the legislative or other relevant measures taken with a view to giving effect to the principles and commitments of the charter. This report should be submitted to the various African Union organs and appropriate measures taken to address any issue raised therein. Recognition and award system. The states should institutionalize a transparent and impartial system for recognizing outstanding performance, creativity, and innovation in public service and administration, and support activities for the improvement of the public service. Innovative experiences will be promoted, as well as a system of awards for innovation in the public service that states can enter and be eligible to win. There are 9 articles at the end of the charter, and they cover all legal, regulatory, and incidental aspects, including interpretation, settlement of disputes, signature, ratification, and accession, entry into force, and registration of the charter. No clause in the charter shall affect more favorable legislation on public service and administration. Any dispute or differences arising between states about the interpretation or application of this charter shall be settled amicably through direct consultations between the states, or else the dispute may be referred to the African Court of Justice and Human Rights. The charter contributes to need for a concerted effort to revitalize, professionalize, and strengthen the capacity of the public service and administration in consolidating the democratic gains that member states have achieved through enhanced public service delivery and socio-economic development. It also serves to improve public service delivery, combat corruption, protect the rights of citizens as users of public service, as well as to promote good governance and sustainable development. It also provides a sound framework for ethical government, driven by the imperatives of people's needs and service delivery, and serves to encourage member states' efforts towards modernizing their public and civil services. It also provides a basis for encouraging the exchange of experiences and best practices. And finally, the Charter provides for periodic reviews and the submission of reports to the Executive Council on implementation. Reform measures over the past 2 decades have seen a reduction in size of the public service in Africa. This, coupled with the effects of globalization, economic and political liberalization, and rapid changes in information and communications technology, have all led to the development of ethics, integrity, and professionalism as standards for public officials. It is in this context that the African Charter on Values and Principles of Public Service and Administration was developed and adopted by the African Ministers of Civil Service. It represents a drive to restore the public service to the center of development in Africa. The Charter provides a sound framework for ethical government driven by the imperatives of people's needs and service delivery. The National School of Government intends to popularize the African Charter on Values and Principles of Public Service and Administration, and above all, promote its embeddedness within the African public service across various regions on the continent for an effective and people-centered public service by targeting public servants at various levels, executive, senior, and middle management in public organizations. This will assist public servant agents to gain insights into the efforts required for building a public service that is people-centered, share experiences, and embed the concept of African Renaissance in the public service. The African Union adopted the African Charter on Values and Principles of Public Service and Administration to affirm political commitment to strengthening professionalism and ethics in public service and maintaining its legitimacy in Africa. The public service must adapt and evolve to address the needs of the continent. It is for this reason that the African Charter on Values and Principles of Public Service and Administration presents a roadmap towards the modernization, improvement, and entrenchment of new values of ethical governance of the public service, with a view to promoting integration and sustainable development on the continent. The African Charter on Values and Principles of Public Service and Administration is born out of the AU's commitment to strengthen professionalism and ethics in public service in Africa. It promotes the values and principles of democracy, good governance, human rights, and the right to development. The Charter intends to be a useful reference for the modernization and professionalization of the systems of public management and individual public service employees in countries of Africa. The Charter amplifies the fact that public service employees must possess a series of attributes such as merit, ability, vocation for service, efficiency in the performance of their duties, responsibility, honesty, and adherence to the principles and values of democracy. Values and principles enshrined in the Charter. The AU member states have agreed to implement the Charter in accordance with the following principles: equality of all users of public service and administration, the prohibition of all forms of discrimination on any basis, including place of origin, race, gender, disability, religion, ethnicity, political opinion, membership in a trade union, or any other lawful organization, impartiality, fairness, and due process in the delivery of public services, continuity of public services under all circumstances, adaptability of public services to the needs of users, professionalism and ethics in public service and administration, promotion and protection of rights of users and public service agents, institutionalizing a culture of accountability and integrity and transparency in public service and administration, effective, efficient, and responsible use of resources. Since the late 1980s, many African countries have been reforming their civil services as a part of the process of state redesign. Unfortunately, these reforms have not been very successful in addressing the major problems confronting African civil services. It is in this context that the Charter could play a meaningful role, as it intends to assist AU member states to transform and modernize their public services in order to meet the needs and expectations of citizens. Public service is a term used to mean services provided by government to its citizens, either directly through the public sector or by financing private provision of services. The term is associated with a social consensus, usually expressed through democratic elections, that certain services should be available to all, regardless of income. These services are made available through public institutions, which were established for the sole purpose of addressing the needs of communities without any expectation to make profit. Funds for managing and operationalizing public policies in these institutions come directly or indirectly from contributions made by individuals in the form of taxes. The decision on what services to focus on are value-based, and identifying the values within an organization provides the key to understanding why and how certain activities take place while others do not. Different types of organizations operate on the basis of different value sets, and the public service is no different in having its own unique combination of values. Public service values: respect for human rights and legality. This is a core duty of the public service. Public servants are to respect the dignity and human rights of all people and deliver services according to national laws and regulations. Access to public services. Equal access and non-discrimination are also key. The public service should be easily accessible, ensure that services are delivered close to the users, and be inclusive, to allow all stakeholders to participate in the requisite decision-making regarding service delivery. Access to information. The public service has to establish simple and effective communication systems so that users are informed of any decisions made as well as procedures of the public service. It is important that users know how to access services, and this can be achieved by a clear communication system. Efficient and quality service. Public servants need to deliver a high standard of services with set timeframes for delivery and ensure that the services evolve as the user's needs also evolve. Trust is key between users and public servants, and mechanisms to monitor the effectiveness of service delivery will assist to ensure the systems function correctly and all users are adequately and efficiently served. Modernization of the public service and delivery. Modern technology should be used to facilitate service delivery, and innovative procedures should be introduced to ensure this. Procedures should be simplified and ease formalities related to access and service delivery. Citizen-centered service delivery is an important aspect of ensuring service delivery. It includes how far the needs of citizens can be satisfied within the framework of policy. the comprehensibility and accessibility of administration, the openness of administration to client participation in decision-making, and the availability of redress. In terms of public services, this means that states have an immediate obligation to ensure that deliberate, targeted measures are put into place to secure substantive equality and that all individuals have an equal opportunity to enjoy their right to access public services. The states also have to ease access to adequate services by simplifying, modernizing, and streamlining overly bureaucratic processes, introducing one-stop shops, providing easy access to information and forms, and websites offer similar services. It is always important that centrally formulated policy should take into account the needs of citizens throughout the country to ensure all citizens' rights are catered to. Citizens need to be aware where and how they can access services, what they can expect from the public service, and how they can assist to ensure the services are maintained and continue to be functional. Everyone has a role to play, and it is key that this is made clear. The first article of Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Considering the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, citizens have a number of rights that need to be maintained and promoted in various parts of the world. Therefore, every public administration has a duty to protect and promote the following rights. The human right to water entitles everyone to sufficient, safe, acceptable, physically accessible, and affordable water for personal and domestic uses. The right to health embraces a wide range of socio-economic factors that promote a healthy life. The right to education is both a human right in itself and an indispensable means of realizing other human rights. States will then need to take this further by considering that there are areas of the population that are further disadvantaged and would need special attention to ensure they receive adequate services. The most fundamental aspect of compliance is respect for basic human rights. Individual dignity is at the core of our innate human rights, and there can be no compliance if such rights are not respected and protected. Citizens will also need to be aware that their rights to service do not preclude them from looking after those services. It is important for the state and the citizens to work together to ensure that existing services are protected. There is no vandalism or wanton destruction of infrastructure that supports the citizens. It is when the states and the citizens work together with mutual respect for the rights of each party that the public service can flourish and ensure accessibility of services for all people. Besides promoting the principles and values of the public service, the Charter ensures quality and innovative service delivery that meets the requirements of all stakeholders. It also encourages the efforts of member states in modernizing administration and
Colleagues, good morning. Hello, good morning to all of you. Welcome to the National School of Government. This morning is good to see some of you that we see often in virtual classes. Now you can be here physically. I hope you'll have a good time with us today. So we're starting our program now. We will be, running very swiftly and smoothly. We will randomly be coming to you and placing a microphone before you and asking you to make an intervention. I must welcome Professor Mariana Mazzucato, who's giving a guest lecture today. We will say more about it later on as the program progresses. We welcome Deputy Minister Piki Kekana, Deputy Minister in the Presidency, responsible for monitoring and evaluation. She is a very diligent student of the National School of Government, as much as all of you are, and you can see she attends in person. So those who are attending virtually, sorry for you, you can't take selfies, you can't buy books, you can't interact, and the Deputy Minister is here who always come. We also have another, so by the way, from today, so you know, for 2 years now, 3 years, we introduced what was called the Senior Fellows of the National School of Government, with Professor Mazzucato being one of them and the former Cabinet Secretary being one of them, as well as the Commissioner for BE, who's a former DG of several departments, as well as a former CEO of ESCOM. So from today, they are no longer Senior Fellows of the NSG. From today, they are Distinguished Fellows of this NSG. We have a new group of 3 people who are coming in as fellows. They will be senior. These will be distinguished. We're a school, so people graduate. So when you see them, you must call them Distinguished Fellows of the NSG. We welcome everyone else who's here from various departments in all your portfolios that you hold. Thanks for coming. Some of you were part of the previous cohorts of the executive education program we are running with them. With UCL. Some of you are joining the 5th cohort. I must acknowledge people from National Treasury who've made it possible actually for the last 2 cohorts to happen. They've enabled you to participate without you having to pay a couple of £1,000, and they have come on board again. So thank you and welcome once again, colleagues. So why are we doing this? I want to give you a teaser, actually, which is important for us to locate this conversation we will be having this morning with Professor Mazzucato. Her latest book is called The Big Call. She will touch on it, later on, so you will engage. And I think also copies are on sale outside. I want to tell you a story. In fact, I brought you a surprise, colleagues, not a surprise. I'm sure some of you did interact with this as you left home this morning. So I brought a commodity called avocado. Here it is. You can have it later on, those of you who like eating avocado. But I brought this avocado, Mariana, for us to actually make this conversation today make sense to the colleagues who are here, because this idea of building a developmental state has to be applied for it to make sense to people who are attending today. And I will use the example of the avocado for you to make sense of it. Now, as I said, the conversation about building state capacity, Mariana calls it building dynamic capabilities. And I want to use avocado as an example. And in short, I use this illustration when I explain what does building state capacity mean. That is about the balancing scope and strength. All of us as officials of state, there are programs that we are implementing in our departments. It could be at a directorate level. It could be at a more senior strategic level. That is the weight that we carry. We are given that mandate. Oftentimes, we miss our targets because there is a mismatch between the strength, our capacity to carry and implement vis-a-vis the weight of the mandate before us. So if we use the analogy of the car, we are like those minibus taxis that are moving between Johannesburg and in the border going to Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and elsewhere. In the majority of cases, these are 1-ton trucks carrying 10-ton loads. Right? That's what you see. That's why the police are stopping them for the next 900 kilometers. Of course, they budget. They are very good economists, actually. They even budget for the bribes. I'm told it's about 7 of those bribes. So when they charge you to carry your luggage and for you inside that taxi, they charge, that fee includes the fees for all the bribes they pay along the way on N1. But these are 1-ton trucks that are meant to carry the load that you can see here. So what do engineers do to be able to build strength of the 1-ton truck? So this could be your own directorate in your department, that we are a 1-ton truck carrying a 10-ton load. And that is, in a sense, then what we mean when we talk about building dynamic capabilities. So what engineers will do is they will change the tires, because we may be running on retreads. You can't carry this load running on retreads. So you may have to carry tires. So changing retreads mean there will be instances where you may have to change people. You may need new people who have an ability to run this distance and carry this load. You have to change the springs and do something to augment the suspension system, and of course do something to the engine as well. And some of the issues that Mariana will be talking about today are precisely about what do you do to the engine so that the engine can increase the torque, because the current engine may be running, it was meant to carry 1 ton, but now we are carrying 10 tons. And on the story of avocado, I want all of you colleagues to imagine yourselves as being public servants in a village in Limpopo called Vembe. Now, I'm mentioning Vembe because there is many of the colleagues here who come from Limpopo, Mariana, tell us every harvesting season that they come from a region of the country where there's a lot of avocado. Some of them are public servants. What they don't tell us is that a lot of those avocados, they actually rot, they get spoiled. Some may be the best variants of avocado, but they never reach the market. Yet here is a public servant who tells us that I'm from Limpopo, we produce the best avos in the country. And this is how you see people in the villages carrying avocado. Now, I'll tell you what the journey of understanding the value chain of avocado may make us better public servants. We may provide better support if we understand the avocado that we are harvesting, that our grandmothers and uncles are harvesting in Limpopo, and their impact in the global market. And there's a point that Mariana will be making around the issue of an entrepreneurial stage that is capable and dynamic, that is mission-oriented. Because these avocados and all their variants, if you work for a Department of Agriculture in Vembe and you don't understand all of this, it will be difficult for you to justify why you say Limpopo is the best avos in the country. They can be enjoyed in sushi in Shanghai, but in fact, it gets enjoyed by insects on the ground because there was a problem with packaging. Yet we are official of the Department of Agriculture. You don't understand that how you teach those villagers on when to harvest and how to package and how to move it into the pots is precisely what can actually give them a share in the global avocado value chain. And you can see how South Africa is performing in this regard, that we are now declining. As we are declining, those avocado trees in November continue to produce, but most of it is rotted or it's sold in the street corners of Johannesburg, when in fact, globally, there is such big demand for avocado that I am carrying this morning. And you can see where South Africa exports to. By the way, Netherlands is the second biggest exporter of avocado. They don't have a single tree of avocado, but that is second largest exporter, but they don't plant a single one. Vembe has more avocado that it produces than half of European countries, but it doesn't appear on the global trading table of avocado. And it's because of how we are handling the avocado and how we are able to move it into the market. And so our argument as I finish is to build dynamic state capabilities requires that an official at a local level in the Department of Agriculture, in local government, at water affairs, in transport, and all other departments that are somewhere in this link, that those must understand, if we use this example, the place of South African avocado in the global market. In this case, this is avocado from Chile, and this is how it moves from Chile to Denmark. And in fact, the reason why you see Denmark, you see Netherlands being the second largest is because they are an aggregator. They get avocados from Dominican Republic, from Chile and elsewhere. They bring it and it gets sold. Just as we've seen elsewhere that there's an argument that whilst the US has placed some trade barriers on certain goods of China to the US, you suddenly see a spike in trade between Vietnam and the US because they simply shift those into Vietnam, and those are sold as Vietnamese, and they go into the US. But in this, that is what Netherlands does, and it is known what the origin of the avocado is. So we are saying, lastly, that ourselves as public officials, if we're working in animal health, in many cases, you find a small outbreak of foot and mouth, a government official takes 10 days longer to give a directive that you must quarantine the area. As a consequence, China, Turkey, and all other countries will ban South African red meat because they say it's got foot and mouth. Because there's an official who did not make a connection that if I act swiftly and quarantine that small contained area, South Africa can continue to trade. Because any beef from Hlabialingana with foot and mouth does not mean that the beef from Northern Cape or Northwest also has a foot and mouth disease. And this is how us as public servants and our understanding of our place in the global trade system, how we behave, how we act, the decisions we make, and most of these decisions, Madonna, don't need a minister or the president or a deputy minister, Kekada, or a DG. They need a director of animal health in a particular region, knowing that we must now quarantine this area, because if I don't quarantine they will shut down our exports of red meat. And sometimes it is shut down when it's already at the port, and that will be wasted. And the same goes for many of our farmers who are exporting avocado. When they are about to enjoy sushi in China, they open this avocado from Vembe, and this avocado has a black spot caused by a dent because of poor handling. It is spoiled. And so the lady in Vembe who sold 200 heads of avocado may end up getting income for 50 heads because the rest are spoiled. Because me and you, as government officials who are paid, who are given resources, sometimes drive a buggy, we were not able to assist that community, those households with 10 trees of avocado, and teach them how to handle this so that it can be enjoyed like this. But of course, in some cases, we think avocado is for eating. So in South Africa, avocado is a breakfast thing, and salad. Everywhere else in the world, this is what they use avocado for. Mainly beauty products, and of course, sushi, which many of you enjoy. So Colleagues, we glad that you came this morning. We've got about 2 hours of intense engagement with Professor Mazzucato. We hope that you will enjoy this class and hope to see you in the following classes that are coming on the executive education program that we do with UCL and many others. Welcome once again, and please enjoy. Prof.
Thank you, Busani. Thank you to the principal of the NSG. For us, first of all, I'm here with 3 of my colleagues from the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, and I think you have some of our propaganda there. But the reason I actually set up the Institute 5 years ago was precisely to start thinking about the questions that Busani is asking. How do we actually design our economic systems? How do we design governance of the public sector? How do we design the governance of the private sector? And how do we design their interaction in order to actually deliver? And what do I mean by deliver? So I'm just going to move around because that way the people in the back can actually see me. We sometimes forget that the economy is an outcome. There's no like forces of economic growth or market forces. The market itself is an outcome of how we design and how we make certain decisions. So growth has a rate, but has a direction. And in many parts of the world, including the city where I live in London, in the UK, have a very problematic form of growth. For example, we've had a form of growth that has basically been consumption-led, not investment-led, and that consumption has been fueled by private debt. So the ratio of private debt to disposable income in the United Kingdom is back to what it was just before the financial crisis. And that's what caused the financial crisis. So you'd think that people would be talking about this, that we would be rethinking how do you actually rejig the pattern of growth to be investment-led, innovation-led, and a type of investment and innovation that actually produces more inclusive and sustainable growth, right? Greening our industries, greening the welfare state itself. But that requires conscious decision, it requires capacity, capability within the private sector, within the public sector, and especially their interaction one with another. And that point of the interaction, we often talk about words like partnership, or in my world, my little bit of economics, which is the economics of innovation, we might use, are you going to have a problem if I keep walking in front of you? Innovation ecosystems, we try to sound smart when we use words like ecosystem, but actually we don't define what kind of ecosystem. And if you're a biologist, you're a bit more serious than most economists, and you would say, excuse me, Prof, what are you talking about ecosystem? Are you talking about a predatory ecosystem? Are you talking about a parasitic ecosystem? Are you talking about a symbiotic or mutualistic ecosystem? So a lot of what I'm actually going to be getting at today is how can we take seriously partnership and concepts like collective intelligence and really design the economic system, and by that I mean how the public sector works, how the private sector works, how they work together, but also with civil society organizations, trade unions, which we should remember have been incredibly important in the history of capitalism, right? We have weekends because trade unionists fought for that, died for that. So what does it really mean to take seriously the outcome and then again to design the economic system to get there? And the context, of course, is where we've kind of had a massive wake-up call. And I say kind of because I don't think we've reacted to this wake-up call. So COVID-19 globally reminded us just how badly prepared we are. In Italy, I'm Italian. In fact, I think I was the cause of COVID here. They say that an Italian brought COVID to South Africa. I was here in March 2020 for the first peak meeting, or Presidential Economic Advisory Council meeting. I left, I was healthy. Then the next thing I know, COVID is breaking out, and in South Africa, an Italian brought it, but I don't know. Anyway, I don't think it was me. Anyway, it definitely showed us how badly prepared we were on so many different fronts. Just think of the digital divide. All these kids locked down for a year or 2 years. It massively increased inequality because they stopped accessing their human right to education at home because of the massive differences children, students of all ages have to digital technology. We were incredibly badly prepared with personal protection equipment. In fact, you'll remember most of the early deaths happened in the health sector by health workers who didn't even have just basic PPE, personal protection equipment. Very badly prepared with test and trace. I'll come back to this later because one of the reasons I wrote the big con, the cover you saw before is the American cover. It looks like a horror show. The English cover was a bit more elegant. The test and trace, we were so badly prepared that governments didn't know what to do, and the UK government, for example, outsourced the test and trace to Deloitte. Now, Deloitte is a consulting company that has no history of test and trace capacity, so it was actually quite striking, not only that they failed, but why would the government not, A, have invested in that capacity before, given the infodemic side of pandemics, but also, if they had to outsource it to someone, why did they choose Deloitte? We can talk about that more later. But also, of course, the vaccine. And your own country has coined or used this word vaccine apartheid. Dr. Tedros, the Ethiopian head of the World Health Organization, has used the word vaccine apartheid. Why? Because we ended up with 8 vaccines, but that wasn't the goal. The goal was to vaccinate the world. Even just from a selfish point of view, that's what we should have done, right? Because if it continues to be in one part of the world that remains unvaccinated, the virus starts reproducing and comes back to bite even stronger. Failed miserably. And on that failure, it wasn't just that we had hoarding of vaccines and vaccine nationalism, but how we produced the vaccines in the first place was problematic. So very tight and strong intellectual property rights, the sharing of knowledge. And again, I'll come back to this because actually even what I've just said is not completely correct. The 8 vaccines embedded different types of partnerships between public and private actors. And actually the AstraZeneca vaccine, it wasn't perfect. You know, all these vaccines had different types of problems. With AstraZeneca, there was a procurement problem that also got in the way. But they agreed in their partnership with the public sector, and who do I mean? Oxford University researchers, because it was an Oxford University AstraZeneca vaccine. They actually agreed to partner in what I would call a much more symbiotic way than the Pfizer vaccine, right? So there's nothing like inevitable, public-private. It depends how they work together. And they agreed because the Oxford University researchers funded by the taxpayer. We sometimes forget. In the US, you know, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, the famous American universities are all private. Oxford, Cambridge, the British universities are public, and you yourself have very good public universities here. I just had the honor of being at both the University of Johannesburg and Wits, very good public universities. Because they were publicly funded, the researchers said, you know what, we'll partner with you, but only under certain conditions. And the conditions included knowledge sharing, keeping the prices and the costs low. Why? Because as public researchers, they had that as their vision and mission for their own kind of outcomes related to their research, the impact. Anyway, so there's different ways to do capitalism, there's different ways to do vaccines, but definitely globally we were very unprepared. And are we more prepared now as the permafrost melts, which it is, change, and new viruses come our way? Are we now more prepared? Did we globally invest in global health systems so they're stronger? So, you know, had the virus begun in, for example, some African countries that have much weaker health systems than the Chinese, would we all have globally been worse off? Yes. Did we focus on that to strengthen global health systems across the 5 continents? No. Did we invest in zeroing the digital divide? No. Are healthcare workers definitely more prepared in terms of PPE? I mean, you could just go down the list. Digital governance, the infodemic, the test and trace? No. So yeah, it was a wake-up call, but we're still asleep. And we're also asleep because how we've actually designed our systems, and this is what I'll be talking about, have been designed to fail. We're designed to constantly react to different types of crises, which of course are also interlinked. You know, COVID-19, yes, we have to wash our hands, but underlying that, as I mentioned, we have an economic crisis, a financial crisis, which is still there. Because if private debt to disposable income is at a record level, when that pops and we end up with another financial crisis, it doesn't matter where that financial crisis starts. It will obviously, you know, be like a wave globally and have that ripple effect. We have the climate problem, we have the biodiversity problem, we have a huge water problem, and I'm honored to be co-chairing a new water commission, the economics of water as a common good commission, with Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, the head of the WTO, Tharman Shanmugaratnam, the Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore, and Johan Rockström, one of the best climate scientists, looking at the underlying massive problems we have with water, the quantity, the quality, but also what would it look like to treat the global hydrological cycle as a common good, as something we all look after together. Because as we have, deforestation in Brazil, the work of Johann Rockstrom and his group in Germany have shown that the ramifications are global, right? So it's not just, the Amazon forest. It ends up causing droughts in one place, which then causes a flood in another place, and the over-irrigation. These are all have massive global effects, and yet we don't treat these problems like we didn't treat COVID as a global problem that needed that kind of systemic analysis. And so what my work has done, and the reason I set up the Institute in terms of also providing the underlying training, how do we think differently? What's the new economic theory that we require for much better, not just policy, but interactions between public and private? And, some of the stuff I'm going to say today will not resonate as much with you, because I do think that some of the narrative and framing problems are incredibly context specific, as are, of course, the policy solutions. So I hope that today is much more of a dialogue. If I start saying some things, it's probably because in my head, I'm thinking of the massive bottlenecks that I've experienced in Europe, but also in the US, but also in Latin America. I just toured Latin America and Colombia, Chile, Brazil, and Barbados, and talked to leaders there. But there's definitely local contexts, but underlying a lot of these local contexts in terms of the policy failures is a lot of ideological and static economic theory, which continues to inform, especially but not only our ministries of finance and treasuries, but also the kind of everyday bottlenecks. And John Maynard Keynes, a very famous economist, said that practitioners on the ground trying to do the right thing are often slaves of defunct economic theory, and they're shackled by it. So part of this exercise is to think about better policy, better practice, but always linked with a new way to think about the economy in the economic theory, that whether one has studied economics or not, it doesn't matter. It continues to inform what we think is possible. And one of the things I've focused on in terms of the bottlenecks is that people think that the problem with thinking about the state is the Thatcherite, Reaganite view of the state, get out of the way. That's obviously not the problem in South Africa. It's not the problem in Italy. We have a big state. The state is there, but what kind of state? And the real focus that I've kind of looked at is not so much the Reaganite, Thatcher, the state is not useful, get out of the way. What was Thatcher's quote? If you're on a bus, there's something wrong with you. It's all about the private sector. You should have private homes. We shouldn't have rent. If you're on public transport, you must be, having problems. That's not the real question. The question is, how can it be that the alternative to that in economics, which then has framed policy, has been designed to always be reactive? So in economics, we talk about the role of the state and the public sector as fixing market failures. So the idea is the market is out there. It works in a perfect way, but sometimes it fails, and the state has to come in and fix those problems. So whether that's because there's too little investment in something, like basic research and development or clean water or even defense systems, the state comes in and fills the gap. And that's due to different positive externalities that are seen to be not kind of incentivizing the private sector to invest enough in something because they can't appropriate the profits from it. So the state has to make that investment for the private sector. That's why I sound American. I'm Italian, born in Italy. When I was 5, we moved to America because my dad does nuclear fusion, funded by the US government, and that's a typical area that nuclear fusion, we don't have it, so it's 30 years away. But when we do discover it, and it actually works, it'll be hard for one private company to appropriate the profits. There'll be massive spillovers from that, so the government funds it. That's a typical positive externality that is framed in economics as the reason why the state should come in. And it's a good reason. Then there's negative externalities, the opposite, when the private sector does too much of something, but it's bad. Right? The first is it's not doing enough of the good. The negative externalities is it's doing too much of a bad, like creating pollution. So the state is expected to come in and create perhaps a tax, a carbon tax, a pollution tax, something to disincentivize that behavior. Again, another type of bandage. Or we might have another type of failure, which is information failures, asymmetric information. For that reason, small companies don't get enough finance. Right? Because the big banks, the big finance won't have information on the history of that small company because they just haven't done much. They don't have equity and so on, so they won't give them finance. So that's why we need the state to come in again and fill the gap. Give those cute little companies some finance, because otherwise they won't survive, SME financing. And then there's also coordination failures. So you might have too much private investment in the boom, too little in the bust. So the government, again, comes in to save the day, to do counter-cyclical, not pro-cyclical investment. So all these market failures exist. There's a whole economic theory behind it. If you've ever done a course in kind of Econ 101, relevant to government, you would have learned this. And it's not unuseful. We should not throw the baby out with the bathwater. But what I will argue is there's a problem here, and that's the bandage. You will always be in reactive mode, bandaging something up. You will always be, by you I mean us, the world, the world of government. Too little, too late, and also in like a negative mindset, right? Because you're correcting. It's a correction for something. Some recent work I've been doing, which if we have time I'll get at, is about how do we transform this public good notion, which is correcting for a positive externality, towards the common good version, which is not a correction but an objective, something we can actually reach together, like all the problems I mentioned before, really getting prepared for a pandemic, reducing the digital divide, net zero cities. That requires ambition, imagination, kind of the ability to dream. It will have different contexts locally. It's not cut and paste globally. But the idea that the public good is a correction due to a positive externality itself is kind of a negative mindset, and it also means if you're bandaging, you will always be tinkering on the edges. You will be fixing a problematic system, and it won't get you that kind of transformational growth. As I mentioned in the beginning, we can't just talk about government. The economy is an outcome of public and private and third sector, civil society, but we have a huge problem, and I'm just going to mention it in this slide. I'm not going to talk about it today, because we have limited time. In fact, I should have put my timer on. Oh well. At some point, Busani, you'll tell me when to shut up. We have a huge problem also in the governance of the private sector. So globally, right, many of these large corporates are global. It doesn't matter where they're from. They have global supply chains. We have what people sometimes call an extractive business model in many companies. So this data here is actually out of date. In the last 10 years, so from 2013 to 2012 to 2022, the number is something like close to $9 trillion. That's 12 zeros, has been used by the largest 500 companies in the world just to buy back their own shares. Okay, not reinvesting profits into the economy, extracting them out by buying shares, also massive dividend payouts, which boost stock prices, stock options, and executive pay. This is talked about as a problematic governance model by some scholars who say we need to move away from just maximizing shareholder value to maximizing stakeholder value. So what does that mean? How do we walk the talk of stakeholder value so money is not just reinvested back into the system, but also is improving the lives of workers, working conditions, again, greening supply chains, and so on. And on this, there's a really interesting economist called Gabriel Palma. He's from Chile. He's at Cambridge. He's devised an index of inequality, which is called the Palma Index, which is different from the Gini Index, which looks at how much money is extracted out of the economy by the top 5 to 10% of the population. And I hate to tell you, South Africa is the worst in terms of inequality. The worst. So this is huge. This is hugely problematic in this country, but it's also problematic in many countries. And Pfizer, by the way, coming back to the vaccine, is one of the worst companies in the world in terms of share buybacks. It doesn't even, the amount of money they spend on share buybacks is much, much greater than any money they spend on research and development. And it's also a problem because the drugs that they actually, produce are often on the back of publicly funded research. In the United States, people never talk about this, but $42 billion a year are spent by the taxpayer on health innovation, and somehow the prices of the drugs globally, but definitely in the US, don't kind of take that into account. So this idea of how do we actually get away from not only the extractive model, but really socialize both risks and rewards. So the reason I, again, set up the Institute, but also write all these books and kind of keep ranting, my dad keeps saying, you're always saying the same thing. But I'm like, yeah, but there's different people that I'm speaking to. But anyway, it's because I truly believe that this is a problem. And that's why I keep repeating myself and write different books that say it in different ways. But the reason I wrote Mission Economy is I just started thinking, it's just so crazy how stuck we've become. And we sometimes forget that actually we know how to do things differently. It's not really about reinventing the wheel. In wartime, right? In wartime, government never, in any country, just says, okay, here's some money, hope for the best, go fight, right? We do things like outcomes-oriented procurement. In the US, they just reminded themselves they had this tool after the Korean War that they set up for the Defense Production Procurement Act, which then they started to use both for the vaccines and the PPE. Is that me? Oh. Anyway, so what does it look like to not worry about war, not always have this negative mindset, but to really think of the huge problems that we have around inequality, around climate, around well-being, but at the local level, so, listening to people who actually experience those problems and not just blah, blah, blahing about these very kind of aggregate problems like climate change, but what does it mean on the ground? How do we then really think? How do we redesign our tools to tackle those problems and treat those social problems as seriously in terms of how we organize government, its bureaucracy, and its relationship with other actors, as we know how to do when it's about the military-industrial complex. And I reflected on the NASA story, not because we should learn from the US, but because actually even the US today no longer even knows how to do this. And my argument is we would never get to the moon and back today like we did 52 years ago if we were using the kind of way we think about government and policy and the relationship between public and private. So what happened with the moon landing, I'll just quickly tell you a bit of a story on this because people forget it was an economic challenge, not just a technical one. The first thing Kennedy said, you might remember from his famous speeches, was, we're doing it because it's hard, not because it's easy. So even just pausing a bit, what does that mean? What does it mean to say, we, in government, will fight climate change, we'll try to decrease inequality, we'll try to have a just economic transition, a just energy transition, and we will embrace the difficulty. We're going to embrace the uncertainty. We're not going to just be facilitating, maybe the private sector to do it or a bit of government to do it. Because the word facilitation, which comes from Latin, and in Italian we say facile, that means easy, is the opposite of that kind of narrative they had where they realized that to get to the moon and back, they needed a strong government, they needed to work with the private sector, and they needed lots of different actors in the private sector. So they worked with nutrition, materials, electronics, software. It wasn't just aerospace, in the same way that climate change is not just about renewable energy. It's about changing what we eat, how we move, how we build, right? So it's intersectoral. We need a clear vision. You have vision and mission here all over this wonderful school. We need a vision, we need a mission, but we need to transform that around climate into missions that are as clear as going to the moon and back. And what happened going to the moon and back is they had to solve 1,000 homework problems. Even if they had blown up just before hitting the moon, some people say they never got there, but I don't know if you're conspiracy theorists. But anyway, they did get to the moon and they came back. But even if it had failed, like the Apollo 1 program failed, they still would have succeeded actually from a public sector point of view. Because what they managed to do with this very strong direction from government was then collaborate massively with 400,000 people across the whole economy against sectors, as I mentioned, nutrition, electronics, materials, and solving those problems got us things like camera phones, athletic shoes, home insulation, scratch-resistant lenses, these 20 things that you see there that are on the NASA website. So a huge lesson here is these were spillovers, dynamic spillovers that happened because they were purpose-oriented, solving problems along the way, and the economic growth that then happened, and there was a lot of growth from the military-industrial complex, did not happen because anyone talked about growth. There was no growth mission. No one even bothered talking about productivity. There was a difficult problem, incredibly hard, embracing the uncertainty, organizing public and private to work on it together with strong public leadership, and the solutions, of which many failed, were, are on screen here, but there was many others. And we forget that everything in your iPhone, if you have smartphones and not stupid phones, were also outcomes of such a purpose-oriented public sector funding. And again, I'm reflecting on the US story, but it's an important story because people try to copy the US and then do everything wrong. They think, oh, we need venture capital. We need more private finance. We need more startups. We need more dynamic culture of risk-taking, as opposed to we need to really rethink what does a purpose-oriented, solution-oriented, mission-oriented public sector look like, and how does it work with the private sector, guiding it but not micromanaging it to solve all these different problems. The internet, GPS, touchscreen, Siri. There's nothing in your phone that actually wasn't publicly financed. Then we needed really smart companies like Apple to kind of put them together in cool ways that make us want to buy those phones. That's why actually the whole Apple story is very interesting. They brought in musicians, designers. They basically just packaged stuff up that the state funded. Which doesn't, it's not a critique of Apple. That design and simplicity thinking, if you read Steve Jobs' bio, it's fascinating. By the way, Steve Jobs, when he was running Apple, no share buybacks. Reinvested everything back into production, into innovation, into design. Huge innovation. Look at what's happened to the Apple phone since Tim Cook took over. Massive share buyback schemes. That's a whole other story. I've written articles on it if you're interested. You can find it on Google. Anyway, so how did that happen? It wasn't just because they said, oh, let's partner, let's have a cool ecosystem, the state, business, we can solve problems. No, the first thing the NASA folks did, these are public sector civil servants like people in this room, they said, we ain't gonna get there with the current type of policy we have. We must transform procurement, right? Procurement, as you know, is a huge percentage of every government's budget. Close to 40%, whether it's a small island state like Barbados, where I'm working very closely. I'm very honored to be working closely with the Prime Minister, Mia Mottley, who, if you haven't heard her speeches, look them up. Summit of the Americas, COP28, 27 speech, she's incredible. But whether it's a small island state or a large African state or a US state, one of the 50 states, they all have procurement budgets and they're often wasted. They're not seen as part of the innovation budget. So whether it's the Department of Health, Department of Energy, Department of Defense, there's a procurement budget, how to transform that into an innovation lever. This is what NASA did. They said the current type of procurement they had, which was cost plus, wasn't getting them anywhere. They said to get to the moon and back, we need to change this instrument, this lever that we have to be challenge-oriented, outcomes-oriented, again, all those solutions that happen along the way. And that's, in fact, what then enabled those dynamic spillovers because they had to procure in innovative solutions from different types of companies as solutions to the problems that they set themselves, but without micromanaging, right? So it's a kind of a semi-top-down direction, but very open on the how. Otherwise, if you tell people what to do, it assumes you know, and why should you know if you're not in that sector? And the other thing, the same guy who changed procurement from being cost plus to fixed price, so challenge-oriented with bottom-up innovation, they said no excess profits. So they put it into the contracts with all these companies, the 400,000 people working in the private sector who were working with NASA, were expected to work with NASA, but on equal footing, because NASA knew its role. It had confidence. It wasn't there to just facilitate, de-risk, enable, fix markets, regulate, administer, all these words that you want to fall asleep by the time you've finished this completely weird story we've made up for public institutions. So that confidence was also really important. I often say I come in as an economist, I walk out as a life coach when I talk to different governments, because my experience is there's also a bit of not just depression, but again, all those words I just said, even central banks, lenders of last resort, right? As opposed to, what we would expect from a public bank, an investor of first resort, making those investments, especially in state investment banks or the MDBs that need to make those early investments in high-risk, capital-intensive areas when the private sector is still too risk-averse to invest in. The other thing that was really interesting, these are just like bits of the story that just I don't think are known enough, is that same guy, Ernest Brackett, who said, we ain't going to get to the moon with the current kind of bogus policy we have around procurement. We need no excess profits so it doesn't turn into a gambling machine. Note, he didn't say no profits, no excess profits, no rents. Why? You should only earn in proportion to what you've done, right? He also said, oh, and guess what? We won't even know who to work with in the private sector if we don't invest in our brain. We're going to get captured by brochuremanship. At the time, they didn't have fancy PowerPoints like I have today. They had brochures that the private sector would come in and kind of lobby government, capture government perhaps, to work with them by saying, we're really great. And he said, we won't even know who's great. We won't know which sectors to work with, which firms to work with in those sectors. We won't know how to write the terms of reference, the contracts with the private sector if we become stupid. Why? Because you started to see how much outsourcing was happening from public to private. So the problem was never public sector do everything on your own. Of course not. Huge amounts of collective intelligence was needed, collaboration, innovation, blah, blah, blah. That's what got us those dynamic spillovers, but he was witnessing what then happened exponentially globally was this outsourcing of capacity as Busani said, the dynamic capabilities within public institutions in many countries have been outsourced to the private sector, and who's to blame? The public sector, it's governments who've done that outsourcing. The book, The Big Con, looks at how the consulting industry has taken advantage of that and why it's completely full of all sorts of conflicts of interest. You've experienced that here with Bain. You've also experienced it with Deloitte, PwC, and so on, both in terms of the tax scandals, but also being on both sides of the street. You can't be advising ESCOM while you're also advising the Treasury if one's supposed to be regulating the other. Australia has just had massive scandals around this. But here, think of why is it that the public sector outsources things like test and trace to Deloitte with no expertise in test and trace, as I mentioned before. Why isn't investing within government in those really important capacities and capabilities, which we know that with COVID were so important? And the subtitle, Infantilization of Government, of the new book, this is the more elegant UK cover, is due to a Lord Tory, conservative Lord Agnew, who on the back of seeing how much money the UK government had spent on COVID and Brexit, said, we continue this, we're going to have an infantilized Whitehall, basically babies. Why? Because they don't learn. If you're not doing, you're always on the sideline, just regulating, de-risking, facilitating, you're not learning. And if you're not allowed to learn, because as soon as you make a mistake, you're in the front page of the newspaper, because civil servants aren't supposed to make any mistakes, so you have to, be careful. In Italy, for example, the procurement is done in an agency for anti-corruption. It's called the Agenzia Nazionale dell'Anticorruzione, ANAC. How are you going to be ambitious around outcomes-oriented procurement if the procurement is designed in an agency for anti-corruption? Does that mean we don't care about corruption? Of course not. Corruption, nepotism, state capture, what I hear about a lot from my colleagues in South Africa who say, you're crazy, that won't work here, too much capture. Well, I come from Italy where the mafia itself is an outcome of that kind of very problematic, weak state capacity. The mafia was born in Sicily. There was a very weak state. People just had to help themselves because the state wasn't there. It was very problematic, and they set up a mutual help organization called the Società dei Beati Paoli, which slowly became Cosa Nostra, the famous Italian mafia on Hollywood screens. So what do we do about building that capacity or limiting state capture and so on? It's surely not by limiting the role of a really ambitious tool like procurement, which should be imaginative, should be focused on really difficult challenges, and of course we'll make mistakes along the way. So how do we create safe places within government to make those mistakes? In Chile, they have, for example, Laboratorio de Gobierno, a GovLab, a place where they can sandbox and experiment with new types of policy, and the expectation is you will screw up because it's the first time you're doing it. But what does it mean to give yourself time to do pre-competitive kind of regulatory changes and test it out and not worry that you're going to be failing? We did a study about this with the UNDP, UN Development Program, during COVID, and looked at which countries in the developing world did better in terms of reacting, preempting a lot of the problems. And we found it was countries like Kerala in India, a region of India, Vietnam, Togo, Rwanda, that had on the back of previous crises decided to actually invest in that administrative capacity, including what's very important, which is the capacity to govern data and digital, including handling that kind of infodemic side of the problem while balancing it with the privacy concerns, of course, we all have with data. But that requires a conscious decision to invest within the ability of government to deal with data. One of the first conversations Busani and I had in Pretoria, that famous March 2020, before COVID became a household word, you were telling me how tragic it was that the government here, due to Treasury insistence on reducing the public budget, had decided to reduce the budget for the National Statistics Authority or office. So that ability, we should invest more in that capacity if we want a more capable state, which ultimately, if it's capable, will also reduce debt to GDP. Why? Because the GDP side starts growing. We have increases in productivity when public and private make investments in all sorts of important innovation areas, right? Italy, by the way, we were forced to reduce our deficit after the financial crisis in order to get any sort of European recovery. And what happened? We reduced the deficit, but debt to GDP went up. It's not rocket science why that is. If the if the numerator debt is growing just by a little, because we're being forced to cut the deficit, and we end up cutting things like publicly funded research and development. Spain cut its publicly funded R&D by 40% after the financial crisis due to these conditionalities coming from the so-called troika, then the denominator doesn't grow, right? So productivity doesn't grow, GDP, long-term GDP growth doesn't happen. So you end up with this very common situation where the obsession with the deficit, if it's actually cutting the wrong things, right? So the details matter. What are you cutting? What are you investing in? How can you invest in education, in public health, but also in training and science industry linkages through things like the Fraunhofer Institutes in Germany that are critical to economic growth, then it doesn't matter if the short-term deficit is high. If those are smart investments, they will increase that long-run GDP growth, and debt to GDP will stay in check. Whereas Italy reduced its deficit and debt to GDP rose massively. And so really the question is, what does all this mean then for the social goals around hunger, around poverty, around having a zero gender disparity, so gender equality, decent work and economic growth, affordable and clean energy. And this work that we're doing on missions that we want to talk to you about today is about how to actually learn from the moonshot, the mission-oriented approach, not as a rhetoric, because there's a lot of rhetoric when people use moonshots, and I hear that you have your own discussions here that have been kind of just using the word but making it just empty rhetoric. In missions as well, we might just confuse it and just say missions are just when you have a plan, whereas I'm talking about missions as a way to get lots of different sectors to work together in different ways. I'll come back to this slide later. What does it mean for how do we design policy? What does it mean for how we design institutions? What does it mean for how we design partnerships to socialize both risks and rewards, those no excess profits? I'm going to do all these in a bit of detail in a minute. And for co-creation and participation, so we're not just throwing policy at our citizenry, but actually, when possible, especially at the local level, involving different stakeholders and voices at the design of these kind of really important moonshots, as bold as going to the moon and back at a short amount of time, but relevant to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which every country, including South Africa, has signed up to. And we all sometimes mention them, the SDGs, again, on gender parity, on climate, on clean oceans, on fair work. Trade unionists talk about that particular one a lot, but then we don't design the economic system to deliver on that. It would be as though, with the Apollo program, they just said, beat the Russians, and then just hoped it would work, without transforming the space race and the Sputnik moment into a concrete mission that required all those different sectors to work together. And so the work we did with the European Commission was to say, let's actually test this. Let's redesign a policy. Let's experiment with it. What would it mean to change the innovation program of the European Commission to not just be about giving money out to certain sectors like AI, quantum computing, life sciences, climate, but actually to have a section of that program, which is about 100 billion for the European Commission, to be mission-oriented. So starting with the grand challenges, turning it into a mission, getting every sector to work together, and redesigning the grants, the loans, the procurement to crowd in those bottom-up solutions, but towards the goal. What often happens is this figure is the other way, just rains projects, right? Lots of little climate projects, lots of little projects maybe even around health, but the sum is not greater than the parts because there's no mission towards which they're all actually supposed to be going. And the government itself has no idea where it's going, so it doesn't even put any conditionality attached to any of its programs. As my old colleague who passed away, who helped set up a very famous innovation school used to say, it ends up like pissing in the wind, just kind of supporting lots of different things, and then it comes back in your face. It's a very technical word. Anyway, so examples in this report I wrote, on the back of which the European Commission actually did this. It's kind of nice as an academic, someone actually listened. So now there's 5 mission areas around climate, around sustainable cities, around cancer. I mean, they basically chose 5 mission areas within which now they're implementing the mission approach. But the idea, as you see, is start out with something like climate change, which is SDG 13, turn it into a concrete goal, 100 carbon neutral European cities by 2030, and really get as many different sectors together, real estate, energy, food, mobility, environment, and crowd in those bottom-up solutions. What does it mean to be mission-oriented? The mission has to be bold and inspirational, otherwise it doesn't work because no one cares. It doesn't kind of inspire confidence, it doesn't inspire new ways of thinking. The business community doesn't even see it as an interesting area to invest in. clear direction. You have to be able to actually say, yes or no, did you achieve it? Did you get to the moon and back in a short amount of time, preventing the blah, 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 which the teenagers are telling us we're doing with climate? Ambitious while realistic, working with the industrial capacity, but stretching the frontier of those sectors, really, again, by requiring investment within our sectors and transformative investment as opposed to just giving out guarantees and subsidies. We need cross-sectoral, cross-disciplinary. In academia, this means not just STEM subjects, but also the humanities. It's really interesting that Roosevelt brought artists into the WPA after the Great Depression, because the idea was that we also need the arts, not just the sciences, to help us think, where do we even want to go, right? So poetry, culture actually is quite important if we can bring that kind of interesting way of thinking to help us reimagine even which direction do we want to go in. But the main thing is to make sure that it's really driving those multiple bottom-up solutions. So a clear direction, but bottom-up activity. Getting away from that idea that this is just about big state telling everyone what to do. We worked very closely with the UK, because the UK had a typical, many countries have this, sector-based industrial strategy. It was life sciences, creative sector, automobiles, aerospace, and finance. Those were the 5 sectors the government, when we started working with them, cared about. It was like, who cares about those sectors? What about all these other sectors in the economy? And maybe those sectors were just more powerful and lobbied their way up. Or maybe some of the companies were able to, lobby also through problematic ways of capturing government policy. So we said, focus on challenges. They chose these 4 challenges: clean growth, future of mobility, aging, and the data economy. And the idea was, how do you then structure an industrial strategy that's not focused on sectors, but challenges, and uses missions underneath each one of these challenges to drive that cross-sectoral activity and innovation. You can't read this, but this was a report we wrote for them on the future of mobility. By having a mission that was very long, it's not as easy as going to the moon and back, that was by 2040 to put the UK at the forefront of safe, sustainable, universally accessible travel, creating congestion and admission-free zero accident systems. It's a mouthful. It meant that some of those bottom-up projects had to come in the world of disabilities. Because if you're going to have a 100% accessible public transport system, you're going to need a lot of innovation by people who've actually been working around the question of disabilities and equal access across all different types of models. So you see, again, this would then require to change how we think about transport, not as a sector, but as an input into a future mobility strategy. This means that government itself no longer sees its Ministry of Transport as the only one that thinks about mobility, but you need lots of different ministries. So it requires interministerial, but also intersectoral acting. In Latin America, we focused on the implication of this also for the natural resource curse, something very relevant to any country that is growing mainly due to extraction of resources, whether it's mining or oil. What does it mean to actually get out of that natural resource curse? It's currently a sexy resource in Latin America, lithium. We need it for our electric cars, but the natural resource curse has been that countries like Chile, which were extracting copper, South Africa, gold, unless you actually move up the value chain, you're stuck. Because first of all, you just extract it all out, and at some point it runs out, and then you have nothing else. How do you actually create an ecosystem around that resource, for example, around digital services, but also make sure that that same resource is part of a solution towards a more inclusive and sustainable type of production? So what do I mean by that? How to make sure that the conditionalities linked also to the subsidies for that sector are linked to that sector also transforming how it works. In Germany, an example would be with steel, which is also extractive in many ways. Because they had a very clear energy strategy called the Energiewende, the conditions set by their public bank, like your IDC, kind of, was that the sector, steel, had to lower its material content of production in order to access 1 penny out of the government. They now have the greenest steel in the world, not because they went to Davos to talk about purpose and stakeholder value, but because they had to get €1 out of the government. So they did it through repurpose, reuse, recycle technology across the whole supply chain of steel production. Imagine if that kind of conditionality that's mission aligned but open on the how can really transform our natural resources, which are of course important for growth, but good growth and not bad growth. We've been working with some colleagues like Kenneth Creamer and Grover Stein here in South Africa around what this would look like around the just green transition. We published a paper last year on that. So these are, again, just examples for us to work out what could happen, what the challenges are, where the bottlenecks are, where the vested interests are that stop this from happening. But you kind of get the point. If the challenge is something like the just green transition, the mission is by 2040 to put South Africa at the forefront of sustainable, inclusive and digitally enhanced resource-based industrialization, what it means for mining, for digital, for energy, for agriculture, and these bottom-up projects. There's one here with ESCOM, financial, public-private financial restructure. Very easy to put that down as a project. Energy grid operation restructuring, energy storage. God, you really can't see this. It's very fuzzy. Concessional finance, conditional and decarbonizing, and having a standards framing to do that. I mean, it does feel a bit blah, 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 but the point is the framework, right? A just green transition requires a mission that's clear. Perhaps this is the wrong one. That's what needs to be negotiated at the local level, also at the regional level, and for example, your coal mining districts, and thinking how it can really catalyze that cross-sectoral interaction, including food, automotive, finance, and really crowd in through that redesign of public loans, procurement, and so on, these solutions. These missions always have to sit above any ministry, so that the so-called all-of-government approach, it's not just a slogan. You need to do that if you care about the mission. NASA realized that it needed to do that after the Apollo 1 fire, where one of the astronauts who died, burned alive in the lunar module, his name was Gus Grissom, yelled, it was tragic, before dying, how the hell are we going to get to the moon if we can't even talk between 2 or 3 buildings? Because the astronauts died because they weren't communicating well with the mission control room. And NASA learned on the back of that fire that they were very siloed. And they brought in this guy, George Mueller from Bell Labs, to break down the silos of within NASA, to get all the different project managers delegated with their teams, but in constant communication with each other. So a horizontal, right, kind of each project leader with their teams doing great work, all those bottom-up solutions to the problems they were facing, but in constant communication between the departments. So they didn't do it because it was a sexy thing to do because they came to NSG. They did it because they had to in order to get to the moon. They realized they needed a purpose orientation and communication between all their departments. Otherwise, they were failing in terms of communication. I don't have time to go into the details, but how to implement missions obviously is not easy. A key issue is how do you crowd in other forms of finance? How do you get a risk-loving culture, but also learning from the failures? The point is not just take risks for the sake of the risks, but invest within the institution to become a learning organization, to even embrace some of that uncertainty through the job structures themselves. I once asked the head of ARPA-E, which was modeled around DARPA, which invested in the internet and the US Department of Defense, how they work. They said, we actually judge our workers by how much risk they're willing to take, right? So if you never fail and you're just doing easy stuff, you basically don't get your job renewed. But also how much impact, society-wide impact the successes have. So the idea is try to do the crazy stuff, fail along the way, but make sure you're not just tinkering on the edges. So what does that mean, again, for intra-organizational culture, impact-driven targets, and so on? So really quickly, just to finish off, to give you a sense that this isn't just about the moon landing, that's just like a huge technological feat. We've been working with very local communities like Camden, the part of London where we sit. You might know Camden goes from Hampstead Heath, a beautiful park, all the way down to the British Museum. UCL is actually right in the middle. We also have the Wellcome Trust, the British Library, the British Museum, and yet we sit side by side with extreme poverty. So Somerstown, which is right close to St. Pancras Station, 2-hour train ride to Paris. But every weekend there's knife crime amongst young teenagers from low social and economic backgrounds. The inequality is massive. We've had a huge rise in food banks. So the missions setting in Camden was very important. We brought this approach, working very closely with the council. It's being driven by the council. I don't know, Sarah, if you can just read off the 5 mission areas that we chose.
Can you hear me?
No.
Yeah? Great. Okay, so the first mission was, by 2030, those holding positions of power in Camden are as diverse as our community, and the next generation is ready to follow. The second, by 2025, every young person has access to economic opportunity that enables them to be safe and secure. The third, By 2030, everyone eats well every day with nutritious, affordable, sustainable food. And the fourth, by 2030, Camden's estates and streets are creative and sustainable.
Yeah. So the estates mission was actually the clean growth one, and the first thing we did was to bring the people living on the social housing estates to the table to design the clean growth mission, debating even what we mean by green, sustainable, so it's not just, again, kind of a top-down academic concept. They decided that a very important thing was to transform the food banks, which again rose because we have extreme inequality in London and the UK and many parts of the West, into green food cooperatives, so the people benefiting from the food bank were actually in charge, which increases your self-worth, your dignity. As you know, many people are not happy when they have to walk into a food bank. Another thing was actually setting up a Camden Wealth Fund. There's lots of wealth created in Camden. Most of it gets extracted out, including that in the music industry. We're a hub of international music production. Does the community actually benefit from that in terms of the arts center, so on? No. Google, Facebook all sit on Camden land. They themselves are quite extractive. We talked about actually getting not only the business rate, some of the tax that they pay into Camden, into the wealth fund, but also a direct contribution in recognition that their own success is partly fruit of this incredibly socially creative and a social infrastructure around. The one on youth actually is very interesting because precisely it goes to that problem of crime, the social and economic determinants of crime, as opposed to just treating the symptom through policing. What does it mean to really invest in our youth centers in ways that they themselves become the hubs of innovation, as opposed to just, at best, don't cut the money, invest in it. That's not enough. How we design youth centers to really be the hubs, even of the data commons, for example, is something that we're working on, also with some local artists. In Scotland, we helped set up a new public bank. The problem is not finance. We need patient, long-term finance. There's often not enough of it, but what you don't want is that these public finance institutions just give out money to whichever sector screams the loudest. Again, coming back to that steel example. So they tried to link a mission-oriented bank with the national missions, which they link towards the SDGs. And the idea here is to really change the mindset. Instead of picking winners, picking the willing. Instead of having, again, those bogus sectors that we think are the most important, leaving other sectors behind, how do you actually create that kind of conditionality that pulls people in small, medium enterprises that are willing to work with the local or regional or national government around some of the very difficult areas, like the digital divide question, reducing it to zero. With the European Investment Bank, again, we kind of tried to link the bank to the 5 mission areas and asked, what does that mean for your own obsession with your AAA rating? The bank is not very risk-loving and has been obsessed with its rating. Otherwise, the interest rates, of course, globally change. And we asked and worked with them on changing how they thought themselves about risk-reward relationships. Lastly, what's really important, coming back to that one of my first slides on the extractive corporate governance models, what does it really mean to create a mission-oriented new type of public-private partnership, changing our forms of corporate governance while we're also changing this mindset within government to not be market-fixing, but market-shaping, producing a direction of growth that's inclusive and sustainable. Some work we've done in the US, you might know there's huge amounts of money the US is putting into the Inflation Reduction Act. Separately, they also have the CHIPS Act, which is trying to get chip sovereignty in the United States, because they found with the supply chain problems after COVID and the Ukraine war that they were completely reliant on chips made in Taiwan, but this potentially just becomes another problem. First of all, it becomes a problem for the world. There's lots of capital flying out of Africa today and Latin America going to the US because of these subsidies. So we should look at the global effect that some of these subsidies have. But even in the US, it was a problem because it potentially was just another socialization of risk, privatization of reward, which we did with the internet and so on. Google, what would they be without the internet? Uber, what would it be without GPS? These are all publicly funded by the taxpayer, and yet the profits, mega profits in these sectors, have gone simply to private with very little conditionality. So within the CHIPS Act, we've been working with the Secretary of Commerce to say, what would it look like if a bold plan around chip sovereignty included within it good work, good pay, green energy efficiency in terms of the supply chain, and limiting this financialized corporate governance that plagues South Africa and the US in terms of extractive kind of share buyback which is just a symptom of that financialization. So limiting share buybacks and dividend payouts. Why? Because you're benefiting from a public program. How do we make sure that the behavior of the company is also changing so there's a true kind of common good direction? In France, this mean-looking guy is the Minister of Finance. They put conditionalities linked to the COVID bailouts. So Renault and Air France had to commit during COVID to reduce their carbon emissions to get 1 penny out of the government. In the UK, we didn't do that. We gave 600 million to EasyJet, one of our airlines, no conditions attached. Nothing. That's not the way to do good capitalism. Obviously, I already talked about the vaccine. What does this mean for, again, embedding within how we produce, how we innovate when we require collective intelligence, rules about knowledge sharing, about making sure that prices are not in excess given the huge collective contribution. But again, those ideas of the patent pool, which actually your own president was very vociferous about during COVID, that should be at the design level. So we fight inequality in a pre-distributive way, getting those conditions right ex ante between capital and labor, public and private, but also public and public. We should remember public conditionalities would mean like conditionalities between, say, ESCOM and the Treasury. That's public and public. It's not just public and private. But it's all about getting the conditions right between value-creating actors ex ante and not waiting for ex post to things to go wrong. I'll just finish by saying that we had, while we were here yesterday at Wits University with Mizzou, the head of Wits, a 2-hour workshop, really thinking also what this means in terms of the sharing of knowledge between some of our South African colleagues and some colleagues globally that together have been working through our institute by meeting once a year, sharing the challenges and opportunities that the particular organizations face, whether it's a public bank, a digital agency, a city-level agency, an innovation agency, of what, the challenges and opportunities of stepping outside the market failure fixing box. This is something that we're very keen perhaps to bring some of the actors in this room into future discussions. This is just some examples, whether it's public banks, the Greater London Authority. The BBC is fascinating. Why? They have a metric inside the BBC that holds the state accountable. It's called public value. So when they decided to not just do documentaries and high-quality news, which is what many public broadcasters do, because they think the rest is for business, they said, we're doing soap operas and talk shows too, but we're going to hold ourselves accountable to make sure it's good for people and planet. So they did EastEnders, soap operas about the working class at the time, back then, when all global soap operas was about the rich and famous. Right? So, or girls soccer, women's soccer, which is something football, that they really focused on. So what does it mean to, in any area a public entity is working on, to hold itself accountable with a metric like public value, which for the BBC was the summation of individual value, how good is the program, societal value, fighting against fake news, industry value, pushing the frontier of technology like the iPlayer or the BBC Micra back in the 1980s, which ultimately creates a landscape even for the business community to invest in. It creates a market opportunity, but because you're being bold in pushing the frontier. So this is the last slide, finally. Sorry if I've gone over, but Busani told me to speak, which is kind of frames everything I've just said just into 4 buckets of topics that maybe we can also use. We can just keep it up for a bit as we're discussing, because what we've tried to do, if it's not just about fixing markets, if it's not about static cost-benefit analysis and net present value, but something else, like those dynamic spillovers or public value, how do we start asking different questions? So it's not about just new answers, the different questions. So Roots, Organizations, Assessment, Risks and Reward, the acronym is ROAR, because in the front cover of my book, The Entrepreneurial State, I had a lion and a pussycat, due to an interesting letter that Keynes wrote to Roosevelt. He said, we got a problem. Businesses aren't lions, tigers, and wolves. They're a bunch of pussycats. And he wasn't saying it to dismiss business, but he was saying it, we need to even get the desire to invest, what I would call the desire to roar. That's very different from thinking you have a lion in a cage. You just need to get rid of the red tape and they're going to invest. What if they don't even want to invest? What if you have what my friend in Brazil said, that Brazil is capitalism without capitalists? There's not enough business investment. There's, again, also in Brazil, this problem of extraction. So that's why it says ROAR. So Roots is about how do we set directions, the route. while not micromanaging, keeping open the how, but a clear direction. This is the missions bit. Organizational change. How do we actually build organizational cultures that welcome risk-taking, uncertainty, that are agile and flexible, like NASA realized it had to be to get to the moon when Gus Grissom yelled, how the hell are we going to get there if we can't talk between 2 or 3 buildings? Assessment, it's all about that dynamic evaluation, which, dynamic spillover is not net present value. They would have never bothered with the moon landing had they done a cost-benefit analysis. No way, too risky. And risks and rewards, how do we share the benefits so we don't do what the US did later, where they did all the investments in tech and pharmaceuticals, and you just end up with the highest profit level we've ever seen in the world. The profit share of global income is at the highest it's ever been due to the lack of sharing of rewards that have actually been created by a collective investment, but then been privatized. So that kind of idea of inclusive growth done ex ante in a pre-distributive way, not just redistributive. I'm done, otherwise I'll never shut up. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. No, let's take the first set. I want to challenge you. If they can go to slide number 9, and that's because I will want Tsidiso Matona and Lerato Matabuke and the colleagues from trade and industry to reflect.
Which slide was that?
On this slide. Slide number 9 is the one with the spillovers.
Oh.
Yeah. The spillovers. I would like them to. I would like them to reflect on this because, so the former DG here, presided over a multi-billion rand department.
Which one are you talking about?
This one, Matuna.
Raise your hand.
Yeah.
Which one?
The one next to the deputy
The man.
minister.
Okay.
Yeah.
You need to point them out. You need to go. You.
Well, we can't.
Why do I not become controversial first?
No,
Yes,
I'm
please.
coming to you.
Come controversial.
All of them, because I want to talk to all of them so that even Tsidiso feel very guilty.
Okay, let's do that. Okay.
You go.
So, Deputy Minister, wait, just to acknowledge that there are ministers who are on the Zoom platform who have joined. The Deputy President, Paul Mashatile, is also on the platform, and there are mayors and premiers and other people who are attending this class this afternoon. Just to acknowledge them, they can see us at times, but we are unable to see them. So, Deputy Minister, please proceed.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think the session that we are in, it's like parliament. Yeah?
Sorry, but it's not public, by the way, so it's
There's-
only
there's
exclusive
limits.
to, yeah.
So we are being very constructive. We're doing self-introspection, and we want to build back better.
Yeah.
That's the approach. And we're looking we are trying to look at what Prof was presenting here to us to say, wake up, guys. There's a ticking time bomb. It's a wake-up call. We are saying as South Africa, and that's one of our first priority, building a capable state. And Prof is talking about building dynamic capabilities. I'm challenging all of us here, and I want to observe protocols from what our Prof has said, Prof. Busani, or on the ministers and the DP who's online. I was sitting here painting, but also thinking about the experiences that we had with the Kenya School of Governance. We were addressed by very old professors, but men and women who made Kenya to work during the time of President Kibaki. They said, look, we sat with Kibaki, we said to him, you stop this, no lending, nothing. This is how Kenya is going to look at, and this is where the center is. Exactly what you have just said on where the mission must come from, where it must be located, what are the things that needs to be done. And once we can get those things right as South Africa, place, planning, monitoring and evaluation at the center. The presidency must start to run this thing. Then treasury will come with money, not the other way around. That's where we must start. We must say, what are the problems of South Africa? There may be 10, but at least let's pick up 4. And then say, lock, stock and barrel, whether the skies are falling or whatever, let's focus on these 4 and deal with them diligently. That's what that thing is saying. Because otherwise we'll be all over every day, and then every time we are coming back, same story, same thing. So this engagement must just make us to look at things differently and be like those guys, those professors there. I want to just show you a few examples. Whether you talk PPP, which National Treasury, because one of the things that I like about Prof is that she's saying, even if you do public-private partnership, you don't want to micromanage, but you also want government to be in control and make sure that things happen. But what is the situation with us? Once we go into PPP, private sector want to, we even go way out of some of these things, and things don't end up not happening. And our PPPs don't even take off ground. 2, all of us seated here, why is it not in our interest to make the post bank to work? When all other countries have their own banks everywhere, is it not in our interest not to make the post bank to work? Number 3, a ticking time bomb that we have seen. And I'll give you an example. Medico-legal claim in South Africa using the Eastern Cape. We went there. Doranginza Hospital. You know, in Kenya they're saying they are into this thing of changing the mindset. That's what they said. They are in that thing, changing the mindset. They are saying in this hospital, it's an emergency hospital. Now, emergency, Prof, means you only go to that hospital if you have twins to go and deliver, if your child is a breech, if you are a 10-year-old, you have to deliver through cesarean, and. That's emergency. Now, they have 65 beds. I'm giving an example. I may not be accurate with the number. When I was there, 65 beds in the ward, 85 people in that ward, 43 people waiting outside in that hospital. We are entering, DM Health, me, DM Public Works, and everybody. And we just start by interviewing those who are outside. We're not CDSO. How long have you been there? 3 weeks. What is your issue? I'm expecting triplets. Emergency. When? What is your issue? I'm 11 years old. I have to go through. Then you go into the hospital. Professors, nurses, and everybody, they are overwhelmed. But there's also another person in the department who's a doctor who delays procurement of certain things. Now the same hospital get a lot of cerebral palsied children. What does it mean? Negligence and all these things and so on. But also, not only that, because not everybody will be cerebral palsied. Human element is there. Officials are now able to steal the papers, collude with the not doctors, with the lawyers, and then they create all these things. Because Road Accident Fund has closed the tab. Now the best thing is to go to Medico. That's where the guys are. Now 2 weeks ago we went to JIPA, Government Employees Pension Fund. You know what they do in JIPA? When people go on pension, the lawyers go there and say, "Chidi, so you can actually get a better deal or take all your money out and then we can take it somewhere and then you do." And you know, with JIPA and GEPF, you take just a little bit and the rest you can get it until you die. So you know what they do? They advise people to do that, and then poor teachers and nurses, and I'm a teacher by profession, they take that money and they do that, and then 3 months, 4 months down the line, they say, "No, your money is exhausted." Now those people come back to become the state's problem. And these are the things, you see, one of the things that I like about what Prof was saying, research and development. Because we did not go there for that thing, by the way, of wanting to know about pension fund. The reason why we went, it was me, Deputy Minister Pinky, and Deputy Minister Majake Pilan. Because of the concern of 40,000 young people who defrauded NSFAS. We wanted to know, why did these kids do this? But our biggest suspicion was that it may be public servants, because many of us are single parents and we may not be able to afford. Now, the kids say to them, "Mama, just say you are not a public servant." And it has far-reaching implications. Now, who is there to do some of these researches to help government to proactively respond and deal with some of these things? So what she is saying on investment, on research and development, on every little challenge that confronts South Africa is very important. Currently, the issue of electricity, yes, but the issue of water is going to be another one. We should be talking amongst ourselves to say a JoJo tank must be mandatory in every household. Let's harvest rainwater. Let's make sure everybody does that, and so on and so on. So I'm just saying, these are agilities that we are being told as public servants. Let's be different. You know, some of these things overwhelm us because people just come to us and start to say, "Look, Pinky, we see these things and we think from planning and monitoring you can be able to look at that." Shocking issue. Stats SA tells us every day, South Africa, you are an unequal society. That's what Stats SA say. But every day, every SONA or budget, we appropriate more than R1 trillion. How does it correspond to deal with some of these things? That's why I'm saying, what she has said, especially on the mission, on what are the things that we think we want to address as a country, it becomes very important. That thing of us competing as departments and wanting to do this thing, but also SOEs must come to the party. They have to come to the party. It's so embarrassing sometimes to see, what is this thing about Chidi? So, black industrialists, women wanting to do all these things, and then they say to them, "No, you don't qualify, you can't get this money, you can't do all this." It was on the papers some few weeks ago. And you know what Kenya said to us? "South Africa, we are worried about you. And let's tell you in your face, During apartheid, because you had sanctions, that's why I said let me be controversial as well. During apartheid, because you had sanctions, you built capacity inside and industrialized and built so many things, whether Roy Falk or what. But today, you can't even innovate. When you were the leader of industry, you are exporting all your minerals to all these countries. You can't beneficiate yourself when you are supposed to be the leader. And then the West people stood up, and this is my last one. The mindset guy from Seoul. What is that? South Korea.
South
ne?
Korea.
That guy stood up and said, let's tell you, South Africa. This is where we started. You know, the bombing and everything. But come today, because of the mindset and changing our mindset as South Korea, this is who we are. Pinky, we told you, when you guys in Limpopo came to Seoul, on the PGMs wanting to do all these things, we said we are going to be the leader in chips, in what, in all these things, and in chrome and everything. And today, yes, we are, but we don't even have a single mine. So can we wake up, guys? We are sitting here, we are painting. We can't be using NSG to come here and listen and not go and do a difference. We can't. Otherwise, let's close shop. Because I'm just going to go for a campaign. And I'm taking all of you, your numbers and everything. We are going on a campaign, and it must start in the universities. It must start everywhere. Let's join, let's go. You see, the good thing about what she said, which is my last thing, even when they talk about the mission, there's good coordination in government, but not only that, integration of all the things. That's what they also do. But the last thing, societal engagement. So there's ownership. Everybody plays his or her role. So these are some of the things that we are doing. Nothing stops us from going back to communities to say, throwing these things all over and making the country dirty comes back to you and it will deal with you. So I'm very proud of being part of your students today, because you are really getting me to be at another level and putting more impetus to some of the things for us to think differently. And Prof, thank you so much. They can
Thank
now
you.
talk. I'm going to
No,
Thank you.
no, thank you, DM. Prof, you want to start with that? I mean, there's a silver lining
Should we
there.
get more? I mean, I can just maybe have a
You
quick
can-
reaction if
Yeah,
you
yeah,
want.
yeah.
First of all,
There's a-
thank you so much. For us, this is a listening exercise, so I should have talked less. Sorry if I talk too much. The first, I mean, you highlighted the R&D point. Sorry, I should stand up. One of the problems is precisely, just like I said, growth is the outcome. A mission on growth doesn't make sense. Unfortunately, it also has to do with R&D. A lot of people say, we want R&D, we want to become a knowledge economy. In the UK, we have a number, 2.5% we need to spend, because that's what Germany spends. But it's the mission that then requires the R&D. So if there's nothing, that's the goal, then it just becomes, again, propaganda and a slogan about the R&D. And another thing you said, I think, highlighting is just like, we just have to normalize this stuff. Every department, as you say, everyone in this room. So a good example I forgot to mention was Sweden. Sweden has just normalized this stuff. So lunch, school lunch, right? What's more normal than lunch that kids eat in their public schools? In Sweden, it's a moonshot. Lunch has to be healthy, tasty, and sustainable. So there's an innovation characteristic which means that, again, the procurement, which, as I mentioned, is often just a boring thing, becomes a part of the innovation budget. It requires R&D to make healthy, tasty, sustainable food. It requires a new supply chain. And the cool thing about the participation, which you also mentioned, it becomes also a way to get kids interested, because do you remember when you were in school, you couldn't wait to have lunch? So if all of a sudden the lunch is also something you can help design, it goes through your curriculum, it changes the supply chain, the agribusiness, the food supply, the relationship between the public sector and those small, medium, or large companies procuring in the food, it just becomes a little microcosm. And I think the only way to start doing things differently, the mindset change, is start testing it. Why not start with school lunch? Test it out. What is the new relationship to get you, one, out of a bottleneck of an old way of thinking, an old way of designing, an old relationship, all of a sudden something new. Learn it through lunch and then scale it up to everything else. So there's something about the sandboxing. And I think, I love your idea of just taking everyone on the ride, but I think the best thing would be to find some spaces, comes back to the GovLab idea, where you can test out some of the new way of working, which means something here, because this is not cut and pasteable across the world. So I'll shut up, because otherwise I'm going to go back into a monologue.
But this presupposes
Yeah.
that there is a Mandarin class available in the state.
Yeah.
Right?
But
a
they're all here, no?
A kind of public servant who can translate that into actionable points.
Well,
Who
first
can
it needs
interpret
leadership.
the mandate
Yeah.
and do it.
I mean, I don't know. My experiences, again, I'm from Italy, I've said that many times, but the reason I say it is we have so many problems. We're slow, the state is bureaucratic, everyone complains. There's also capture, corruption, nepotism, blah, blah, blah. And yet, COVID comes, millions of people are dying. Lombardy was the place, and in 3 months, it took 3 months for Italy to wake up. We went from being 100% reliant on Chinese PPE, personal protection equipment. In 3 months, we had all the PPE in Italy made by 137 small, medium enterprises. Why? Because they had to. They had to, because everyone was, you remember on the television screens, Italy was the first on the battlefield in terms of the deaths, many old people, you saw them being carried out of, homes and so on. So they, again, changed quickly the procurement to be outcomes-oriented, around a goal, bang, 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 they got it done. So I just think it's a question also of urgency and leadership, and we shouldn't have to wait for wars or for the next pandemic where millions of people are dying. But if you have leadership and then transform the tools, the institutions, the relationships, the mindset kind of follows. Otherwise, we risk, making a folkloric thing about the mindset. We need, just a whole new change in culture, and culture changes. Once you have leadership, you say, we're going to get this done, and it has to happen. And I love your point about the state-owned enterprise, because the question, maybe we can go to the fellow near you, because were you also heading up ESCOM, did I hear in the beginning?
Yes.
Yes, okay, good. So just, and I don't, obviously in this country, ESCOM gets a lot of attention, but again, IRI in Italy, l'Istituzione della Ricostruzione Italiana, huge state-owned enterprise set up with Mussolini, had 3 phases. Public, not politicized. Public, super politicized, all the parties got their hands in, and then privatized. The second and third were massive failures. The first, unfortunately, it was set up again by Mussolini, so not a great era to talk about. But anyway, let's just look at the public sector driven. It attracted the top managers because it was mission-oriented. They made the Autostrada del Sole, which is the motorway that goes from the north to the end of the boot, in 4 years. Now, they've been taking 20 years for the Torino-Milano. It's still crap, no? I mean, no state capacity in Italy. We are getting the biggest chunk of the European recovery program. It's 2 trillion euros, 365 billion come to Italy. It's not absorbed. There's no absorptive capacity. We have not invested within the state capability. And it's terrible to think that it was in the fascist phase. I don't glorify, I'm very anti-fascist, hence I'm also very critical of the current government. That's a whole other discussion we can have over lunch. But the point is, there was clear vision for what it was for. Italy was 75% agricultural at the time. In few years, they became industrialized because they had mission-oriented agencies that were not politicized. They were not captured. Later, they all got captured. So how do we uncapture your state-owned enterprises and create a new relationship between public and public, with the Treasury putting conditionality on the enterprise to become part of the solution, like the German government transformed steel production to become green through conditionality, through how the public bank, which is like a state-owned enterprise, interact with the sector. I think it's, we need to learn where it works, where it doesn't, and what it might mean for ESCOM.
So we're gonna get each table to ask a question. We're gonna start here. We're gonna start in this table. Please, Prof, you can note them down so that we can move swiftly. So take the microphone, introduce yourself, and then we flow.
Good morning.
One question each so that we can get as many colleagues as possible.
Thanks. Prof, it's very interesting what you mentioned about how the entrepreneurial state should be made. But my concern is that we've got context of South Africa being a situation where supply chain system is being abused to a point where even created a term called tenderpreneurship, because people hijack the system of supply chain to serve nefarious interests of corruption. So how do we ensure that this creation of this state accommodates that? And by the way, public value issue theory is sort of like constrained by philosophical questions of whose value are we talking about? So maybe we need to see as to how can we, when we create this entrepreneurial state, how do we ensure that we are not constrained by the concept of whose value are we talking about?
Sorry, whose value, you said?
Whose public value?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, we move to this table. Okay, go ahead, Lerato, please proceed. Please stand up so that you can be seen.
Good morning. Thank you. Thank you, Prof. Thank you for your presentation. Very good. My name is Lerato Matabuche. Okay.
Please, the
Sarah,
colleagues
feel
on the
free to
Zoom
help me with
platform.
the answers because you have great
Those
answers.
on the
Okay.
Zoom platform, please, yeah.
Thank you, Prof. I'm Lerato Matabuche. I'm
Call
with
me
the-
Mariana. From now on, I'm
Hi,
Mariana.
Mariana. You still owe us a sourdough book, by the way. But thank you so much for the input. I think mine is around the type of attitude that is required in the public service to get us to a mission-oriented delivery, I suppose, process. I think one of the challenges we have is also the new social compacting we need to do with organized labor. One of the challenges that management would raise in public service, for example, is if you're coming with anything innovative that has to change how we do things, you'll be told, for example, that's not in a role profile. What does that mean for, the jobs of the
Yeah.
people that are involved? So the mindset shift, how do we get that properly done, and what kind of compacting do we need with organized labor to get that happening?
Okay, this table, there's a microphone somewhere. And it take us, Deputy Minister, here is one of the senior managers from Department of Health in the Eastern Cape,
Okay.
Dr. Singh. So he may not respond on the issue raised, but you may get his card afterwards.
A very good morning to the Deputy Minister and the audience. My question is to Prof. What damage does the centralized tendering system in government, especially when you have these national tenders, can hamstring service delivery and have spin-offs or lead to too much powerful individuals, which would be tantamount to corruption at the expense of service delivery? Thank you.
Okay, let's take the outliers, not in the manner in which they are written about in the book. The outliers, a question here. Okay, the question, Kalum.
Thanks.
Sorry.
Thanks, Prof. You spoke about one of the things you spoke about moving from the public good to the common good.
Yeah.
So, how would we do that? Would you have any pointers for us? Because I can see the value, but how do we actually get there? Thanks.
All right, we move to the table at the back. That table, that table, and there is the colleagues there. Please do stand up just for the benefit of the Zoom. Colleagues, they need to see you and stand next to DG Nkuna there. Thank you.
My boss.
Remember to introduce yourself so that people know who's talking.
Morning, Mariana.
Thank you.
I did meet you earlier on before you started speaking, and really a great presentation you've made. My name is Mametse Masamola. I'm with Infrastructure South Africa. My question really is on, if I can just get that. So I'm astonished that we are trapped in this Reaganism, Thatcherism narrative that says that, government is simply an obstacle to development, to growth, to building competitive industries, etc. That everything that the private sector does is better, and government is not able to or can never match that type of capability, that type of skills, that type of, just the capacity to execute, to plan and execute. How do we change that in practical terms? You talk about the private sector governance systems that needs to be overhauled essentially, especially in the South African context where South Africa, in government, we come in as if we are beholden to the private sector, that we are not able to lead, to drive these mission critical interventions. We seem to be coming in, that we're not capable enough. And it's because of this narrative that's been driven over and over again that the state is not capable of leading and so on. How do we do that in a most practical fashion? We have a mission in the country. We want to grow infrastructure investments to be constitute 30% of South Africa's GDP by 2030. That's a mission, that's a target that we've set.
Sorry, can you say it again?
We have a target set in our National Development Plan to grow infrastructure investments in the country to constitute 30% of gross domestic product by 2030. We know that's the target, that's the mission. But we are unable to, in my view, to move away from tinkering on the edges when you talk about procurement, when you talk about sectoral plans, etc. How do we make all of those things to have that whole of government approach, to work better with the private sector, to do that social compacting that Lerato spoke about? How do we get all of these things to align and to be purposeful and galvanize everybody else to be able to reach and not reach, but achieve that outcome that we are, or the target that we have set ourselves? How do we overhaul all of that? That's my question in a long-winded way, but I really want to understand, how do we take all of that you've spoken about into the practical? Yes.
Nice.
Okay, I'm gonna skip you. The DG, the two DGs, they will speak later because
Okay.
they also carry a lot of responsibilities. They sign for multi-billion rand budgets in their departments.
So it's their
and
fault.
They make decisions, yeah. So I'm gonna go to this table. I'm coming to you, keep the microphone because I'm gonna come to you. And the BE Commissioner, I'm coming to you as well. Remember to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Prof. The name is Mandla Klaba from the Department of Human Settlements. We settle our citizens. And my biggest concern here, Prof, is the issue of now we're no longer talking about public and private sector. I see you have added citizen groups. What I would like to know, what type of citizen groups that we can work with as government so that we are able to do what exactly the DM has just said here, that we need to go out there and talk to the right people so that we are able to implement what the government is failing to implement. Secondly, is the issue of you saying, in all the efforts that we are trying to do, we have some challenges with academics in agreeing with you. So how do we overcome that? Thank you, Prof.
Sorry, I missed the last bit about academics.
The issue of they are not in agreement with you, or you're having challenges with them, and how will you overcome that? Because that's the people who provide us with information. If they are not in supportive of your initiatives, how do we get there? Thank you, Prof.
Okay, the last question before I get back to you. Mariana is from Tobago, is my intern. He's a economist by training. And the question to him is, do you think there is a future for, I mean, after this conversation, the future for young people in the country with skills, specialized skills like economists, like big data specialists? Will the state be the employer of choice, you know, in the mission-oriented approach to how we build the capacity of the state?
Thank you, Principal. My name is Ntobeko Makubane. Nice to meet you, Prof. The answer is simply no. The state is not the preferred employer of the youth. Currently, with the issues that we are facing as young people of South Africa is mainly to be economically excluded. It is well known that in South Africa there are two economies, and the first quarter of 2023 labor survey statistics indicated that the youth unemployment is now over 40%, and their labor participation is also around, although the labor participation is around 70%. So briefly, I would respond by saying that with the current nature of how things are taken in the economy currently, no, the youth, the future for youth is really not convincing. And also the fact that the Prof mentioned about decision making, the bureaucracy that is capable, and also the government that is mission orientated. I think those are three main characteristics that our country is battling with. So, unfortunately, Principal, the answer is negative. Thank you.
Okay, Prof, you want to take those ones?
Sure. Maybe I'll just begin with the last one, because guess what the average age was in Mission Control Room in NASA, the Apollo program? 25. That was the average age amongst the people in the room that got those three guys to the moon and back. And there was something about, you know, this I would almost call mission mystique. Like, and I'll tell you a different quick story. Obama, after the financial crisis, Europe blamed the public sector. We embarked on a massive wave of austerity. We cut everything. In England, we cut public libraries, public health, mental health, public education to get that deficit down, because that was going to make us, you know, roar again. It killed it. Like today, we have, you know, huge inequality also on the back of that. The U.S. didn't do that. They had a proper recovery. It was 800 billion, but they decided to make it green directed initially. Then the Tea Party came in and, you know, it was chaos. That attracted so many people to go into government. Why? Because all of a sudden, the idea was not only will there be a stimulus, but it's going to be a cool stimulus which is going to transform the economy. So they were able to attract a Nobel Prize winning physicist, I'll get to the youth bit in a minute, to be a civil servant. He won the Nobel Prize. He was at Stanford University, physics. He would never have agreed to be the Minister of Energy, which is what he became, Department of Energy, had the mission been, oh, come in, it comes to the other question, which I'll tackle after this, you know, come in and help us de-risk and facilitate the cool value creators in the private sector, or help us devise a carbon tax, or help us just give a bit of support, R&D or whatever, to the green businesses. No, the government was in the driver's seat. It was going to be massive stimulus program to transform and redirect the economy, and this guy was like, I'm there. I'm leaving Stanford University, and I'm happy to be a minister. So what do we need to do? The question here, it also comes to the mindset, to literally change the remit. Again, a vision, a mission, but at the ministry level, at the department level, at the agency level. And when I say agency, I don't mean the agencies you guys have. Apparently you have 771, which is part of the privatization problem. I literally mean like well, like the NASA agency, right? It was a National Space Agency. So what does it mean to actually say this is going to be at the center of the system, in the driver's seat, but drive towards some sort of measure of public value and have a metric of it which inspires? No? If you actually look at why the BBC continues to attract top journalists, forget the recent crisis they've had with Gary Lineker. I don't know if you guys know what happens in these soccer worlds, but anyway, they continue to attract young talent in the BBC. It's seen as a place where you learn. They invest in the people. They actually have an R&D department no one even knows about. They are market shaping, not market fixing. It attracts huge talent. And because, as I mentioned, they've been pushing the frontiers, they end up creating lots of spin-outs. Lots of kind of startups have actually come out of the BBC. And so I think the question of youth, I know so many countries, who doesn't like to talk about youth, the youth policy here and there, but the best way to make something useful for the youth, first of all, is to change these programs in government that are particularly going to help youth startups, youth entrepreneurship scale up. That's also what the US government has done through public procurement. They have this SBIR, where every single government department, health, energy, defense, have to use 5% of their budget to procure in solutions from small companies, and then they put characteristics on those companies, whether it's black-owned, women-owned, youth. And what happens is that policy then scales up those companies, because there's too much talk about startups. And anytime someone talks about youth, they talk about entrepreneurship and startups. But who cares about startups if they just start and then don't continue, right? So the scaling, helping to create a market where youth-driven businesses and new entrepreneurial solutions, including to the school lunch problem, just to normalize all this, it's not about the moonshot, but lunch can be a moonshot. And actually structuring those policies that are explicit around youth, but also perhaps disadvantaged youth. It depends. That's going to depend on a country's priorities. But the other great thing, which was kind of insinuated in your question, is how do you make it really sexy to work in government? Sorry. If that's a bit, you know what I mean? Like, the more government is allowed to take risks within the civil service, it kind of comes to the, again, attitude question. How can we change the attitude, the mindset, the HR, human resource, the job descriptions? Let me tell you, I am literally going to have a nervous breakdown soon, because my own university, UCL, I guess this is Chatham House, I don't know, is in the public sector in the UK, and I think we're a great university, but the HR practices, the job descriptions are incredibly static, incredibly problematic. There's a distinction between the professional services, so like secretaries, administrators, and the academics, two totally different kind of rules and tracks, and one is allowed to be really static, very little performance metrics, and the academics are overly evaluated constantly with student evaluation and research evaluation. What would it mean to actually make them all part of the same mission and make it really cool to be part of a secretarial team, an administrative team? That's what NASA did. The janitor in NASA cleaning the floors, that famous story when Kennedy walked in and said, "So what are you doing?" And he's like, "I'm helping to put a man on the moon." And again, it could just be like a romantic folkloric story, but changing these job structures so every job inside government is equally kind of not only mission aligned, but where it's cool to be part of an organization that sees itself as transforming, part of the engine. The book, The Big Con, we talk about how the consultants have slowly come to the center. They used to be on the side. They are now doing the doing. Anyway, so, the youth policies are not working, partly because the policies themselves are not really designing opportunities for entrepreneurship, like my example with procurement, but also if you want to get youth into government, you better make it really cool and see yourself as a risk taker, not a de-risker. If you have two jobs, and one you're seeing as value creating, and you're allowed to take risks and make a mistake and learn from it, and you're actually rewarded from taking those risks, and the other, as soon as you make a mistake, you're either fined or, we heard yesterday, killed. One of the questions I heard last night was in the municipal authorities, a lot of public servants risk their lives, right? So really, getting around that obviously is going to be but that's, a huge issue. So the attitude mindset, I've just mentioned it, it's so incredibly important, but we need to be actually, looking at how we actually set up the jobs themselves. As I mentioned in ARPA-E, they actually reward people by how much risk they're willing to take and how much impact their successes have. The common good question, Okay, so this is a big question. So first of all, the difference is one is a correction, and this actually comes to the other point that was made about, you know, the civil servants feeling like they're always just beholden to some sort of private sector initiative, private sector value creation, which, by the way, I had a nice discussion with the president the other day. I'm not allowed, am I allowed to say what we talked about? I'm sure we are. One of the things we talked about, your president, he told me a story I didn't know, I should know if I read the history books about ESCOM. I hadn't realized that in 1998 there had been sort of a mandate that actually was going to be the private sector that was going to, you know, invest massively in the energy infrastructure here, and there was an explicit mandate for ESCOM to stop spending and investing on the structures and on the maintenance, because the assumption that the private sector would take over, and slowly it actually withered away that capacity, and then, you know, we can add the other parts of the history on top of that. But that's exactly what has happened in many parts of the world, coming back to the EDI example I gave in Italy, and that's all informed by this ideology that somehow the public sector is supposed to be regulating, administering, fixing, and the private sector builds, creates, makes value, right? Now, because then of all the dysfunctions that get created around that, it's not that the public sector actually becomes really weak. You have a large public sector here. You do have state and ministers who think their job is to do stuff, but without those metrics, creativity, investments that actually, you know, create kind of that capable state. So we need to move away from whether it's state or private, is the state just beholden to the private sector, to say to truly get rid of that ideology that the private sector creates value and the public sector just redistributes it. We have to be investing within that capacity and capability. But the common good point is that everything we've talked about, whether it's healthy, tasty school meals, whether it's creating a vaccine that actually is available to everyone in the world, whether it's reducing the digital divide or have it, you know, carbon neutral or, you know, net zero, whatever kind of region that then requires a city and the mayor to work, you know, across the board on how everything is done in a city, from nutrition to mobility, that requires a really bold objective. So getting out of the correction towards the objective, and then with the common good framing, giving just as much importance to the how as to the what. So the design of the collaboration, coming back to the dysfunctional Pfizer collaboration, and the more functional, not perfect, AstraZeneca-Oxford collaboration. The design of the finance, how can we make sure we get rid of this conditionality on finance that reduced fiscal capacity, that increases it, something, I'll be in Paris next week for the Bridgetown initiative that Mia Motley and Macron kind of put together about increasing that fiscal space through the design of the finance, if we're looking at global finance, but that itself is not enough. You need the finance to actually, again, be embedding notions of where we want to go, otherwise we just get into the handout problem. Again, Cassa Depositi e Prestiti, my public bank in Italy, is part of the problem. It just gives out money. And it gives out money to companies that are like, help! Why should we help you? Just because you're rubbish? No, we're going to help you transform. We're going to help you conditional on you making those investments in your workforce, in green procurement, in lowering the material content. We won't micromanage it because that would kill the innovation, but we're going to help you if you're part of the solution. So that design of the financial institution, of the loan program, the design of the patent pool program, the design of any sort of public-private kind of collective intelligence area really, really matters. And unless there's a common good framing to it, you waste it. And that's what happened to the vaccines. Everyone said, we did it, vaccines. No, that was not the goal. The goal was to vaccinate the world. And you failed miserably. You screwed up, and it's a crime, right? But that was a public good framing as opposed to a common good one. Oh God, so supply chain, the first one was on, well, corruption, basically. I don't know. I mean, maybe you should come in, Busani, because I feel like,
I would
yeah.
deal with it.
You'll deal with that? Okay.
Yeah.
But I'll just say one thing. Sometimes I'm criticized a lot, but one of the things that I'm criticized for, you know, if you're a woman, you're left-leaning, governments actually try to do what you say, and you're in the media, bum! So I do get attacked a lot. But just to say, one of the things I get attacked a lot for is, oh, she's just glorifying the state. She loves the state. It's the opposite. All of this is to hold the state accountable. especially in countries like mine and yours where we have weak state capacity. You don't just accept it and say we have corruption, so that means we need either the consultants or the philanthropists. The Gates Foundation will solve the day with health. And by the way, they're a very problematic foundation in terms of how they deal with intellectual property rights. So how do we build the state capacity now while also tackling, of course, the corruption challenges? And by actually getting serious about the metrics, how do we then evaluate a public investment program outside of this really static public choice theory, new public management framing, which got us, cost-benefit analysis and that kind of stuff, towards these dynamic spillovers, making sure the impact is truly cross-sectoral, cross-economic, as opposed to serving one ministry, one sector, one type of firm, which can easily capture government. So what I'm talking about is a weak state is more easily captured. An entrepreneurial state, my first book where I kind of retold the history of Silicon Valley, but also then sped forward, what are the lessons today to also hold the state accountable so it doesn't just create the internet, but actually creates it in such a way that's good for people and planet, as opposed to what we have now where we just didn't think through any of these big tech problems that we have today because we thought it was just enough to put technology into the system. Those are the details. Who defines what value is? That's really, really important, no? I mean, public value, what does that mean? And that's why, we actually require research around this. I don't know how much the National School of Government works also with kind of researchers, whether you have a postdocs and PhDs, Busani, but we need to get better at this because otherwise you're right, it itself, just like the concept of missions and moonshots, can get captured. Oh yeah, we're doing it for public value. Oh yeah, this is a great mission and moonshot, it's great for society. Who decides? Right? So even who decides the mission? So with the moonshot, it was literally a bunch of guys in the room. That's not how we do the SDGs. So also coming to the question about citizenry, how do we involve citizens? What does that mean? Increasingly, I think, we need to learn from the local examples. It's very hard to do this starting, and also comes to the decentralization question. It's very hard to talk about co-creation and participation really, as opposed to tokenistically, through some sort of consultation program. So for real, when we just skip right to the national, federal, or even global level. We need to learn, especially, I think, from cities. I'm increasingly learning from city mayors, or Georgia Gould, who's my counselor in Camden, because they are closer to the community, but we can test out that participatory method. For example, in this Camden Wealth Fund, putting some of the youth that have been quite disadvantaged, but who are value creators. A lot of youth in Camden do rap music. 1 in a million makes money. The Stormzys, the Daves, a lot of them end up in the criminal justice system. They're all creating value. They've contributed to the history of hip hop and rap. Fashion too, there's a whole history of fashion, how it's actually been driven in many ways by people from lower social and economic backgrounds, but again, the value does not come back to them. So what does it mean to govern a wealth fund that's a community wealth fund with people on the governance board, those very people who have created value but have not been seen as value creators, have been marginalized, and even part of a music industry which embraces that marginalization, because that's what, if you look at the history of Tupac Shakur, it's so interesting. When he was talking explicitly about the inequality and how to get rid of it, he was almost shunned by the music industry. They loved it instead when he was just talking about guns and women and drugs. So really rethinking the music industry, for example, the value creation, the value extraction through the youth who are creating the music and who would sit on the board of a community wealth fund, is just a very practical way to start upsetting these dysfunctional dynamics where at best we have the high and mighty like myself doing good for, as opposed to with and learning from those on the ground who are most experiencing. And surely if we want to learn from the pandemic, we better be listening to the care workers, the nurses. I mean, in the UK, what is totally crazy, but this is a global problem, we succeeded on one thing, the vaccine rollout, and that's because it was distributed through a decentralized network of GP practices. There was a trust in the community. We then failed miserably, as I already said, in the privatized test and trace system. So what do? Did we fund now a decentralized network of GP practices? No, we've decided post-COVID to kill it, to actually, well, not kill it, to defund that system so the nurses and doctors, junior doctors, are on the streets striking in London. They are not being paid a living wage. Many cannot, pay the rent and so on. So it's just the and did we continue to give contracts to the Deloittes that failed on test and trace? Yes. So we're not learning from the lessons of a decentralized network of GP practices, the welfare state decentralized through capable, able, horizontal communication, but dynamic teams and so on. So we're doing the opposite of the moonshot, also in terms of the investments. I think I've covered almost everything. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm gonna get
Implement settlements, yeah.
the two DGs. They must talk about what's to be done. We are not asking questions. We are not allowed. You've got authority. You command huge bureaucracies. You've got policy instruments. Do not ask Mariana a question.
Good.
Based on what has been discussed now, what is to be done?
Reflections.
We start with DG, DPME, Nkuna. Anyway, you are a participant here, so don't be scared of your deputy minister. Here, talk as a DG, DPME. What is to be done? Oh, you missed the story.
Okay.
You missed the story of the avocado.
Oh, no.
He comes from the region where every time he goes home to Limpopo, he comes back with avocado.
Ah.
Yeah.
And can I take one home?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's from Vembe.
Okay.
Okay, what is the time? Okay.
We have to close. We
good
are wrapping
afternoon.
up at 1 o'clock, so I'm
Yes,
going to give you
yeah.
3 minutes, and then I'm coming
Okay.
to Matuna, and then we will end with you, Deputy Minister.
Okay, good afternoon, colleagues. My name is Robert Nkuna. I'm from the DPME, the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, currently the Director General. Now, first to apologize that I came a little late. I was in the Northwest, one of our provinces, where there's a university there, so I'm trying to be a professor so that I can speak like you. And say the kind of things that you say. But let me start with something that I'm not sure whether I will be assisting. I was going to pose a question, not to Mariana, but to the ministers on the platform, because I think that question needs to be dealt with. It speaks to the external environment, to what you call the public service. What happens outside that permeates and shapes the kind of public service that we have? So I will not ask Mariana that question, but it goes like this very quickly. How far does political ideology become a constraint to what we can do, the choices that we can make? A case in point is that when you have a state institution going on a business rescue, it's unheard of the world over that a state institution is in a business rescue. How does that come about? And how does political ideology influence that? Two, when you have local government, municipalities collapsing, going down, and the president announcing in front of all South Africans that 163 or 168 municipalities are not working, are dysfunctional. So that is 30 years later. And municipalities that are the core of service delivery don't work. So how does political ideology shape that kind of a situation where things fall apart? Now, going to what should be done. Number one, we have a phenomenon that's very problematic, that whenever ministers change, ministers even coming from the same party, same committee, they change everything. They want to change everything. So the proposal is, we need to have a log-in of things that we want to do and make it difficult for people to change government decisions because they just like something and not the other. So this has to be done. Number two, we need to advance a cause that municipal leadership must be protected. And this does not need a long process of legislative change. We just need to take a simple decision that says, if we want to have this kind of innovation, there must be that kind of autonomy where town clerks or municipal managers or city managers are protected so that they can do what they are supposed to do.
As it is currently, the system is not working. Lastly, on performance management, two issues. One is a question around causality. Causality meaning that when you take a decision to say that I'm going to do this, how do you know, how certain are you that that kind of prescription is equal to the problem? So in natural science, it may be easy, but it's a challenge in social science. So it's a matter that we're grappling with to understand better when we come with prescriptions, whether they are equal to the task or not. So there must be a way of measuring whether the prescriptions that we are having are equal to the task. Very lastly is the issue of outcomes. That up to now, we have been measuring outputs, which are very important. It's very important to understand outputs in order to lead to outcomes. But what we have not been able to do and must do as a matter of agency, as we revise the current medium-term strategic framework, is to put more emphasis on outcomes. And the DGs are going to start to have this discussion on the next 5-year term program on how we put more emphasis on outcomes. Certainly many things that one can say, but this is what I can do with 3 minutes. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Matuna?
Oh, we finally let him speak.
Yeah. For his sins, yeah.
Yeah, I thought I was off the hook. First of all, thank you for the very inspiring talk.
Thank you.
And for those who are not here with us, greetings and all protocols observed. And I'm happy to take the baton from my DG there, to be led by the DG in the presidency, because I believe, and you did say this kind of tangentially, the center has a critical role in the mission, in defining the mission. So I think that as far as outcomes are concerned, we will agree with you completely. Approach, I think there's some things that we need to think about in terms of how we are dealing with issues. So for example, I'm now responsible for BEE and the private sector, a broad-based black economic empowerment, which is one of the tools we have to address inequality in South Africa. And business say to me, why does they complain? You know, why does government want us to do this thing? And I think what you are saying is that no, it is not what government wants you to do. It is what the problem of this problem of inequality expects of you to do. So we de-governalize it, as it were. So I like that. So it's not about the private sector or the public sector, it's about solutions to major problems of society. Coming at it from that point of view, I think is an interesting kind of perspective. I want to talk about something that is close to my heart. And it's close to my heart because I belong to a generation of public servants that started on the democratic journey since 1994. And what drove us, so I'm coming to the mindset issue, all right, the purpose issue. Because I think this is where we need to do work. And the school, I think, has to be congratulated for confronting us with this issue of the caliber of public servants who can be part of the mission. All right? The mission requires a certain caliber of people to be on that mission, and this is something very important to me. So we assumed the state leadership roles in the state at the onset of democracy. we were frightened by the sense of responsibility of society and the people. And I say society because it's not being frightened by the politicians, all right, or frightened of the politicians, because we civil servants and the politicians were on one side of the issue. We had this responsibility, and the weight of it focused us and drove us, as it were. And the important, so we were frightened by failure.
Yeah.
The idea of failing on such an important mission of democracy, of empowerment, of liberation of our people. That's what drove us and gave us a very strong sense of purpose. All right, so we were accountable to the outcomes, the objectives of the democracy. And the important thing, talking about context, the politicians gave us the space. They gave us the space to do our work, to take risks. They did not interfere.
Yeah.
All right? And that confidence that politicians had in us itself was an incentive. All right? So we were afraid to fail our bosses. I was afraid to fail the minister. The minister has got such confidence in me. Why would I want to fail the minister? All right? So this whole business of shaping the mindset, how do we develop the sense of purpose? I think we've lost it.
Yeah.
So the context has changed because today's public servants don't come from that era, and so they don't necessarily carry that sense of responsibility. But today's challenges are the poverty. What is our accountability? How can we be in public service and be happy to live? And I'm not saying happy, but we live with these statistics of unemployment. What does it mean for me? The statistics of unemployment and poverty. What is my accountability? What is my role in these outcomes, these results, these statistics, as it were? So we have a lot to talk about in that regard. So the school knows this. I'm passionate about this. It's not something that we should take it for granted. We have to be deliberate in cultivating, in working on the mindset, and working on commitment to the mission, as it were. So the second issue is about decision making. So you said that mission is about conscious decision making, and capabilities. I think the capabilities we can kind of deal with on another occasion. But it's decision making systems. Because somehow our systems don't work. They're not entrepreneurial. Talking about the entrepreneurial state. We just take long to take decisions. All right? So the problem of failing or challenges with state-owned enterprises, for the longest time in my tenure as a DG, this problem has been there. All right? The problem of investment in new energy capacity, those problems, they don't just pop up now. They've been there. But we just take forever. We take forever to act. To act. Why? And by the way, this is a beating I got from a Chinese counterpart of mine who said to me, one of the DGs, I think it was Public Enterprises or something, he said to me, South Africa, why are you growing at less than 2%? Why? You should be growing at 5% or more, because you have everything. You know, you have the foundation. You have the foundation. You have the resources. You have the people. You have everything. You know, why are you growing at such a low percent? But your problem is that you take forever to take decisions. You know, you take forever. All right. So the decision-making system, and again, it's a system. By the way, it's not just politicians. It's politicians and bureaucrats. You know, when you try to inquire about a particular decision in a particular department, you will be told that no, the submission is in the chief director's office. Then you check next time, or they say it's moved to the deputy DG. Then you check 2 weeks later, it's in the DG's office, and then it doesn't come out. Doesn't come out. But remember, there's a decision, there's an investment, a major billion-rand investment that is waiting for this decision. So decision-making, principle, please, can we work on that mindset and decision-making? So for me, those are the two issues I think that we should do. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Deputy Minister, so you carry a much bigger burden than all of this.
Yeah.
You are a member of the executive committee of the ruling party. You are in the presidency, which is the center. You are part of the economic cluster in the state. In fact, you belong across all the clusters of government, very few
Three
departments.
spheres of government, monitoring and evaluation,
Exactly.
and
So-
all SOEs.
Three things. So become our agent here.
Yeah.
I mean, not like the one from the farm, you know. I mean, it's like, but become our agent. Here is a group of the Mandarins who are inspired by the idea that they can pursue missions in whatever role or responsibility they carry, having been empowered by this intervention and a series of other lectures that they will be going through. Can they trust that when you go back to those important decision-making structures where you sit, that in fact you will unlock opportunities and enable them to function, to pursue missions, and get the services into the people? Maybe three things that as our agent, you will be taking into cabinet, to the NEC, and all the other clusters where you sit.
Marianne, one of the things I want to assure you, from there to here, I'm going to get all the numbers, cell phones, everything. We are going to have our own planning session on where do we go from here.
We will host
We
it
have
here.
to be action-oriented, guys. It can't. That's the first thing we are going to do. We are starting now. Before the end of Youth Month, one university with NYDA, we shall have addressed. We'll craft something. All of you sit in your corners, decide on how we approach these things. But I'll tell you, but let me come to what he was afraid to tell you. I mean, I'm very blunt. When he says there's no decision that is being taken, even if there's an opportunity for investment, you know why? What is in it for me? That's the biggest problem. What's my cut? Until you say, I'm getting this, this thing is not gonna move. That's where we are.
Money.
And that's one of the things we must deal with. Because at the end, our people die because of poverty. I can tell you, Kenya told us that South Africa, you are sitting on a ticking time bomb. Every young person is coming to Gauteng. They think there are opportunities. They are living the hinterland, where there's lots of land to grow avocados and do everything. They are going to come here, nyaupe, crime, everything. Even you who stay in a big house and everything, your life is no longer safe as long as that child does not have food on the table. We are not resolving these things. What are we doing? And this is what we, as this cohort, must start to respond to. You know, I like one thing, and this is a takeaway from me. Keeping on bandaging and not going to the root cause. That's what she said. We know what the problem of supply chain is. But let me not just start there. Let me tell you the other biggest problem, which DG Dr. Nkuna spoke to. we have to be deliberate. Public Service Commission must just sit and say, if we want a DG for communication, let's put a panel of specialists who understand this industry, who can interview the DG for communications, and then government get best of the best. Than to put ministers and deputy ministers. Pinky Kekana is a teacher by profession, a geography teacher for that matter, and what, and mama. I'm telling you, if we want the best, let's go and get specialists to do that for us. And Public Service Commission and the Department of Public Administration must start to say, guys, let's be honest. If we want to deliver, we have all the best policies and whatever, but let's do things this way and change and have our DGs for 10 years, then it's fine. But we know at least they shall have been appointed properly. Not only that, accounting officers, including at municipal level. Because even in municipalities, as long as you are a treasurer of an NGO, they can put you to be a CFO. And that's a problem. So these are the things that we now have to look at and say, how do we deal with some of these things? Because as long as we don't deal with some of those things, it is the problem. The last issue on supply chain. Who are the people who run the supply chain? It's yourselves. It's yourselves. There's no minister who sits there. And you are members of trade unions. Now I want us to have a dialogue with the unions and start to say, how? These people of yours are messing up our government. And let's start to take the blame. And not start to say Pinky's department is corrupt. It's not us. It's members of these unions who sit in these things, who do the wrong thing, and then take all these things, and at the end is the minister who gets the blame, yet it is you guys who set on those things. So let's all take that responsibility. I'm telling you, why do you agree to take a wrong decision? Why do you allow Pinky to tell you to say, do this thing? When you are a professional, when you went to school to do that right thing. Let's say enough is enough. It must be in the interest of our people. I'm telling you, these are unpalatable things, but we must say them. And these are the things that we must start to say, guys, we need to look at some of these things. I mean, I agree with you, Tsidiso. But there is this thing that hurts me every day. It hurts me. I'm from Bilamila, Varambat. The plumbers there are aged. They are white. No racial issue. No racial issue. It is because they know the skills and how certain things can make you to make money quick. Our kids don't understand how plumbing is so critical. Our kids don't understand how just fixing these bulbs and all these things, it's so critical. Sit just one day with a blocked toilet in your house. Even if a person can say, pay me 10,000 rand, you'll pay it because you can't stand the smell. But let me tell you, how many informal settlements are there out there? So many. Are we training many young people to become, in the TVETs, to become? Sewer is running everywhere, and that's an opportunity for young people to play in that space. Where are we to start to have those dialogues to say, at least enough plumbers, at least enough? We're not saying everybody must be an electrician, but at least the fixing and all these things. Some of us, our mothers are still there at 85. We don't have anybody in the house. We want somebody, at least, if there are those things, to come and just fix. It's, you know, a call away. Apps are there now. Young people can do those things. Simple things. Because the reality is that many young people are unemployed. And these are the conversations that I want us, this team, to go and start and talk about. Not everybody will be a lawyer. Not everybody will be a CFO. Like I said, I'm a teacher by profession. How I wished that my boy can be a lawyer. But he's playing for Sundowns. Now I want him. He's at camp for Morocco. He's gonna play Bafana Bafana. Tomorrow I must go to AFDA. I never knew there's something called AFDA. My girl is in film. Something that I don't know. So it tells you that we now have to change the mindset and even make sure that TVET's colleges are important colleges for skilling our young people. Thank you very much.
So, Mariana, as you wrap up,
No, wrap up? Oh my God.
yes, as you wrap up,
Yeah.
so we go back to my avocado story, because the DG, DPME come from a region where they produce avocado. They also produce marula, and they sell a lot of that here on the streets of Joburg. They also produce moringa, which is in high demand. They sell that moringa in the streets of Johannesburg. If you look at the global value chain of moringa, Vembe region does not appear. If you look at the trading tables of avocado, Vembe region, which produces the best avocados in Southern Africa, does not appear. In fact, Kenya eats your lunch when it comes to avocado globally. Yet there are public servants like me and you who are here, who've got the resources, who command people, who command respect in the community. You come driving nice buggies there in the community. It happens in many cases that you are the highest paid person in your community. And you enjoy these avocados every day when you are at home. You pick them up, your unemployed cousin shakes the tree, hundreds of them fall. They sell half of them, the rest are spoiled. And when they do sell, they sell them in the streets of Johannesburg. But you are an extension officer. You drive a buggy, state-sponsored, and you are respected by everybody. You have the resources, you've got access to fertilizer, you've got access to insecticides, and everything else that the state has provided. You know this harvesting season, when it is. You may even be an LED officer in a municipality. You can actually buy the boxes because you know what the harvesting season is. But you deliver fertilizer a month after the first rains. You deliver pesticides when half the stock has already been destroyed by pest or something else. And that, in fact, if there is a diesel engine pumping water to an irrigation scheme, that you come 5 days later when there has been an El Nino effect for 5 days, the crops are dying, not irrigated, but you have the budget to buy diesel to put into the generator to pump that machine. And this is who we are, South African public servant. And consequently, those nice avos from Vembe region are not enjoyed by us, those who ate breakfast in hotels this morning. In fact, this avo is from the Western Cape in a commercial farm because that's where they get theirs from Woolworths. So communal farmers have no share in the national or the global. Oh, I might as well buy it at ShopRite. You know, that's the 5th grade that goes there. The other year, I spent a few months in Canada. All the oranges and nutches on sale had a South African flag in them. Had a South African flag throughout Canada. They enjoy South African citrus. And the point is that those are from commercial farmers who understand, who've got resources, they understand the whole global value chain of selling oranges in Canada. And the communal farmers do not have access to the same, but they have us as public servants, whose responsibility is to give the things, the amenities, the resources, the support on time, so that that unemployed cousin busy shaking avocado trees will be told how to harvest avocado if you want to enjoy it in sushi in Shanghai. Because when you shake it, you will only enjoy it in Marabastad in Pretoria. That's what, you know, the kind of change that we are talking about. And that's why we are asking you to return to the simulator, which is the National School of Government, so you get plugged into understanding how the global economy works and how through action and inaction you can undermine the ability of a community or of an industry to grow. As I said earlier on, in terms of those officials who fail to quarantine cows with foot and mouth, and consequently it spreads beyond regions, and we lose a lot of value because globally they shut out our red meat. But there was a public sector official who had the knowledge, the resources, and all the means to go and quarantine. And the person did it because you went to a Shisanyama with the government backing. So, Mariana, if you may wrap up your last interventions. Colleagues, those of you, the books are outside. She will sign some books.
First, we do a group photo. No?
Yeah. What I will do, though, because, you know, I once worked in a production company, actually. I once did a series. I was underpaid for it, but at least I did. It won. It got a national award. So what we'll do is that before we do a group photo, so that we do an intimate thing, once we are finished with your wrapping up, we will put a chair in front of each table. These guys will take 10 photos of you in a table, so people don't move around. We'll put a chair so that you also appear. Then we'll do group photos outside. So please do close. They're going to move the chair. We'll start here. You're just going to sit in front. Everybody faces. And then, yeah. Okay.
Oh, wait. First, I'm going to do my comments.
Yeah.
Really quickly, just to say, first of all, a huge thank you. I'm so glad this was recorded.
Including to the people online, please. The deputy
to the
president,
people online,
the minister.
definitely to the people online, but also just in terms of what we had the honor to absorb and to listen. I can't tell you how empowering it is. This is, as you know, the first lecture of a series that's part of this executive education platform from the Institute. You all have our little flyers, but one of the slides I quickly went over because I was going out of time was that kind of new, vocabulary that I think needs to accompany, but it's really your new vocabulary, and I'm hearing so much from what you're saying. We need to move from this to that. It would be so interesting to ask ourselves during the whole exec ed program, what is the new story, the framing? There's a famous saying, a Native American saying, that storytellers rule the world. Well, if the world is screwed up, we better tell very different stories. That narrative, that change in mindset, it'd be just fascinating to make your version of this, where we're crossing out the words. But just super quickly on what I heard, because it was so interesting, the comments that were just made by our three leaders here. One, the instability. New government comes in, bang, everything starts again. That's everywhere. But one of the ways to deal with that in terms of the capabilities, which you were right to say we didn't focus enough on it today, there's one module that will be taught by Reiner Cattell, my colleague who just wrote a book called Creative Bureaucracies and Dynamic Capabilities, who'll go into it further. But one of those has actually to do with institutional setup. The DARPA model, DARPA, the agency that funded the internet in the US Department of Defense, is famous for thinking about the problem of instability. So people come in for 5 years, not tied to the electoral cycle. So when a new minister comes in, they can't just get rid of it. There's a 5-year which is independent from the electoral cycle. And within that, people are, again, the point I was making, rewarded for taking the risks, no? And they are in there for 5 years on secondment, usually either from a university or from some other organization. So there is also not that kind of obsession with that they want a lifetime career in that agency, which I don't think is in itself a value. It'd be great to have a lifetime career, obviously within the civil service, but there's a movement around. But the point is, it's a 5-year plan, which is just completely independent of the electoral cycle, and it brings a stability to the plans, because if there is change, it's change based on the mission, and change is also good. We need flexibility. We need to know how to pivot. DARPA is famous not only for turning the tap on of investment, but knowing when to turn it off. Right? You don't just keep funding something because someone's reputation is based on it. So I think we need to tackle the two, the instability, but actually the stability of the plan. Can we do long-term planning? And within that, know how to pivot, how to be flexible, and so on. The outcomes versus outputs, that's huge. The reason we brought in the consultants in many parts of the world is because of an output-driven focus, right? All this kind of evaluation, the metrics that are very static around cost, benefit, net present value. We have a chapter of the book that actually looks at it wasn't the neoliberals, it wasn't the conservatives that brought that in. It was actually the third way. So the kind of Tony Blair, Bill Clinton kind of way of thinking of government, where government is needed, but it needs to emulate the efficiency of the private sector without rethinking dynamic efficiency, public purpose, public value, as metrics that we need within the public sector. So outcomes is about the missions, but we should be careful, because if you want to battle obesity, there's 187 factors that determine obesity. So if we want an outcome around obesity, we better have the levers in the collaboration between the departments and the experts outside, as we just heard, who actually know something about those 187 factors without getting burned and buried by the details. But it does mean that alignment between, again, the social and economic determinants of crime is a lot of different factors we need to be investing in terms of our youth. If we just treat it as a policing problem, we're dead. So interesting also the point about the Black empowerment criteria and the critique that you get. It's exactly the critique that Gina Raimondo is getting today in the US because of the CHIPS Act. Because she put in social policy, she said, you're not going to get money if you invest in workers, improve working conditions, don't use share buybacks. Bang, she gets critiqued. Wall Street Journal says, you're confusing social policy with innovation policy. No shit, Sherlock, that's what we're supposed to do. How can you bring together the innovation state and the welfare state, but in a way that's smart, right? So the ambition is amazing. Bring the social goal and the innovation goal together. So they're designed, that's the common good framing that was being asked. But obviously we need to know how to do it. If it becomes a shopping list of 1,000 criteria, then business is right to complain. That's the micromanaging bit. No, but being selective on those really bold conditions, which then require the innovation in order to satisfy those conditions, then that gets you not only the social goal satisfied, but innovation, because you need to innovate in order to achieve that goal, which is, what was being saying. The decision-making too slow, I think we need to be careful, because as I mentioned, we know how to be quick when we have to be quick. So it's a decision to be slow. It's not just because we're slow and we haven't been taught how to be quick. As I mentioned, Italy is so slow, it's beyond slow. When we had to be quick, bang, we were quick because millions of people were dying, right? The urgency. So the big question is not just the mission setting, how do we treat it as urgent? How do we bring urgency? While we also do long-term planning, if something is too urgent, we can also be stupid, just a quick solution, without looking at the social and economic determinants of youth crime. That's a calm understanding of what needs to be done, but treat it as urgent. In London, we have a knife crime epidemic. What should the mission be? 0. 0 teenagers should be dying of being knifed to death in their school uniforms. There's a Barbadian doctor running the Royal London Hospital, which he says it's like MASH. Do you remember MASH, the TV series with the tents and everyone being sewn up? That's what that hospital is. It's 13 to 16-year-old boys, mainly black Londoners. from very poor backgrounds that are, and it's not just black, but it's basically working class, and it's social, economic conditions that are leading to this massive wave on the back of the austerity, which cut everything. But how do you solve that problem? You definitely don't solve it by saying a bit of money here, a bit of money there, more policing on the streets, stir the soup and hope for the best. You need outcomes orientation to the budget itself. You need true collaboration between the mental health, the schools, the police. You need business as well to be creating those opportunities and to give self-worth. And I love just lastly, the point you were making about the youth, and you used the plumbing example. It's so deep what you're saying, but it can be cut up into many different actions. One is the obvious one. And if it's not being done, it's also not being done in Italy, but actually investing in what Germany does well, which is apprenticeships, proper apprenticeships. That's a lot of literature on that. We know about that. And you're right to call it out. But the deeper point, which is much harder, is how do you value? How do you actually tell the youth, every single youth, especially those, or mainly those who've been marginalized, that they have value? My friend from Rwanda told me that after the genocide, where people who had just, actually eaten together almost the night before, then were, killing each other. They said that the way that they created the reparation, the bonding again in society, was through, I can't remember what the saying was in Rwandese, which was, you have value. I mean, that was the, right? Because from being told that your neighbor was a cockroach, that was the words being used, to saying, you are not a cockroach, you have value. What does that mean for an economic program? What did it mean for Camden? What does it mean for London? What does it mean here to actually value the youth, all of our youth, and create dignity and self-worth? But many other programs, investing in them and putting them at the center. And that's why I think, for me, the really bold thing I want to be thinking about is how do you turn the welfare state into an innovation state? How is it not only about, because currently you have the people who worry about care, inequality, youth, crime here, and people talk about innovation, productivity, venture capital, biotech, life sciences, entrepreneurship, startups there. You bring the two together, you use the deepest social problems, and ask how do we innovate towards that? And how do we change who we call an innovator and a value creator and a wealth creator to include all these people who have been made to feel marginalized and not value created and not part of that process. Because it's so much easier to stab someone to death if your own life has no value. Much, much easier, right? So starting with that value creation, dignity, and self-worth as an economic strategy at the center of an industrial innovation strategy instead of just leaving it to the periphery of okay, that's for care, but this is innovation. And I feel like you are teaching me a lot in how you kind of said that, but in your own very interesting ways of telling your experience. But just to say, I'm very inspired. I wish I could stay for weeks to continue speaking, but maybe we can organize a follow-up at the end in terms of did we actually lead to any concrete suggestions on, for example, the capacity, the capability, the new metrics, the outcomes versus outputs, what is the tangible new structures that might be put in place?
Great stuff.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, the chair. So, thank you very much. Please bring the chair. If you may sit here, face the front, they will do their job.
Should I take this off?
You may, no, you can do it. They will remove it later.
Oh my God, this is embarrassing.
These guys are very skilled.
I can't be in front. I need to be looking like we're talking. At least pretend we're talking.
So they will take like long shots because we want to manage the time. So.
Oh, the boss.
Okay. Please sit at the back, Mariana, and
But you must
they've
also
paid.
go with him.
This is very staged.
Yeah. It's better we do it this way, so they take this.
Is he always like this?
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry. It's his fault.
Yeah. No, upstairs. Yeah. Okay. Then we go to the other one.
Are you leaving? But thank you so much. So interesting what you, yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
Oh, no.
And then we go to the next one. Colleagues,
Thank
those
you.
who are done taking picture, they are part of the, yeah.
Do
I
you
saw
count?
that.
Do you
I'll
count
give
as a group? You don't count? Okay. Okay. Oh, my Lord.
So we'll take a group photo outside. The books are outside. You can get the books and then you can get a signature.
Good. Sorry? Okay, last one. Hey, yeah, you came twice.
Space.
Yeah, good.
Grab a snack there, please.
One more.
For the book.
After the group photos.
Good. One more? Okay. I should have brushed my hair at least. One more here. Let me just ask something. Hey, I tell them I don't have time to sign books. We need to go.